The scientific revolution starts now.
This is the Science Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I'm Shane Simonsen, I guess Dr. Shane Simonsen, though it's been a long time since I've been in an academic environment. I don't know, do doctorates go off? Do they have expiration dates? So a bit about me. I'm a former research scientist and currently an experimental farmer, doing his best to understand where I am living in this point in history. And my broad worldview is that we're at the peak of a burst of economic activity based on depleting resources, primarily energy resources like coal and oil, and that our civilization is on track and already partially going through a massive contraction in scale and complexity. So I guess you could call me a collapsnik, is sometimes used as the word for people in my position. But unlike a lot of other people, I think that this isn't just going to be the end of humanity, that it's, game over, we're all going to go extinct, boring. I think that there's opportunities for new kinds of civilization to emerge on the other side of this, particularly based on biological technology, which I think we've only started to scratch the surface of its potential.
Wow. So a collapse in complexity, that's certainly the opposite of what we hear from most people these days. Can you embellish on that a little bit?
Let's focus on AI for an example. So the technology beneath AI, I saw what was it, a talk the other day, someone talking about these very high level issues with AI, and they were completely blind to the bottom of that pyramid, which goes all the way down to like child slaves digging up cobalt in Africa. And chip factories, which are very, very focused geographically in places like Taiwan. And the internet is the largest, most complex, most resource-consuming structure that humans have ever created. And it's constantly breaking and needing hardware and software being replaced. So if the resources that make all of these structures possible crumble away from underneath us, there won't be any chips. It's one of the reasons why in the long run, I'm not worried about like the AI taking over, because it is just so incredibly fragile.
Why do you think that the resources are drying up, I guess is the phrase?
Well, as we talked about in the previous episode, the end of hegemony one, oil seems to be the catalytic resource that makes everything go, particularly when it comes to transportation. And oil is a much more limited resource than coal, and the highest quality oil reserves were used first. So now we're getting into fracking, we're doing offshore, we're looking at extremely difficult places like the Arctic, maybe Antarctic, to go looking for oil. The only reason society is moving into those possibilities is because the most profitable oil is already gone. And it's only going to get more difficult from this point forwards. A really important issue around this is the idea of energy return on energy investment. And the energy system itself is consuming more and more of the energy that society is tapping into, and eventually reach a point where we're getting so little net energy profit that there's nothing left for the rest of civilization to actually run on, even if you still have an energy system left.
But if you're talking about a biological civilization that rises up in the aftermath of the petroleum civilization that we have now, what does that look like in terms of the material basis of that? Because from working in a laboratory, everything's made out of plastic, everything is shipped from distribution centers far away. There's corporations that are involved in the production of, primers and DNA synthesis and all these kinds of things.
So do you mean, are you asking about the broader physical economy or just specifically biological research?
Well, it sounded like you were saying that the civilization after collapse is one that is a biotech civilization, or is that not the right interpretation?
Yeah, no, that is correct. So yeah, you are right. The current model for biotechnology is another one of these extremely complicated and fragile systems. I mean, just look at the bioinformatics that goes into dealing with this flood of DNA sequences that we're generating as fast as we can with the idea that eventually it's all going to make sense and we can just, dial up whatever genome we want. I also think on an informational level, that is irreducibly complex, and our approach of like figuring out one gene at a time and manipulating one gene at a time isn't going to get us anywhere. So the approaches that I can see for biotechnology to decouple from the current mindset is basically to become more agnostic and to tap into the power of trial and error. So one of the techniques that is really, really powerful is hybridization. So when you do CRISPR, you're moving one gene at a time. When I do hybridization, I'm moving thousands of genes in an afternoon. And the trouble with that is that you end up with just a huge amount of diversity. So it's not reductionist. You don't just have that one thing that you want to achieve. But the upside is it allows for serendipity. You create this huge pool of diversity that didn't exist in the parent species. And from that, you can do broad phenotypic screening of whatever you think you might want. And if you look at the origins of civilization, pretty much all of the crops and livestock that we have a hybrid origin. So wheat, for example, is a three-way hybrid of different species, which are now in different genera. So it's a fairly wide cross. Chickens were a three-way hybrid of three species of jungle fowl. Humans, if you look at our evolutionary history, are hybrids as well. We crossed with Neanderthals and Denisovans. And one that isn't getting spoken about very much is there's evidence for admixture of a ghost hominin in sub-Saharan Africa, which in some individuals, it's 19% of their genome is estimated to come from this other hominin, which we're not sure what it was.
Do you see no place for some very targeted therapy or technique in the genetic revolution like CRISPR-Cas? Because it seems like you're imagining a different pathway that is biotechnological, but not in the sense that everybody's used to.
Yeah.
But do you just think there won't be the infrastructure available for those kind of resources, or you think they're just sort of...
I think without bioinformatics, then our current approach to moving one gene at a time is untenable.
And you think it's both futile and too expensive or something like that?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's the results that it gives, the amount of resources that it requires is... the return on investment for it is really poor. I still think that during the downslope of industrial civilization, there will probably be some really interesting things done with the genetic engineering tools that we have. But in the long run, the foundation for it is not going to be there.
But what about medicine? What about the idea of some heritable disease? I don't know, Lou Gehrig's disease or something terrible that you can be screened for and know that you might have it if they could go and edit that gene. It seems like, or stem cells. I don't know. When I think about biotechnology, I think about ending cancer and, making aging less painful, things like that. And obviously there's ways to avoid cancer and aging to some extent, but it seems like there's always going to be a place for these really hyper-specific targeted therapies. At least a want for them. Maybe the resources won't be there, but... So
for genetic diseases, most of them are extremely rare and usually extremely obvious to some degree, though some of them have later onset in life, which is an issue. Definitely the understanding of how genetics works could help societies advise people about whether to have children. I think in the Jewish community, there's a lot of work pre-screening individuals with, what is it? The
Tay-Sachs, I think.
Yes, for Tay-Sachs disease. But
what's that?
The wider spread genetic diseases tend to be things like sickle cell anemia. And they're cases which are a little bit more difficult to justify getting rid of them because they arose for a reason. That's the reason why they're widespread, is they actually give a benefit to the population as a whole, even though you have homozygous individuals that have problems.
But
So
we are trying to eradicate mosquitoes actively. And so there's these two different poles.
Like us personally, or
Yeah, I actually have a
I
gene
do try to
drive.
eradicate them whenever possible.
Well, no, because there's, I think that I'm pretty sure that it's the Bill Gates Foundation that's running the gene drive for mosquitoes to eradicate Zika in Florida. And once they pilot that program, it's inevitable that they're going to start piloting other programs in other places. And so it seems like the eradication of something like sickle cell anemia would make sense if they achieved their goal of destroying the mosquitoes without also destroying the biosphere in the same push.
yes, yeah. And again, this gets back to the idea of how complex biology is, and that you can basically unintended consequences are pretty much guaranteed when you approach it with a reductionist, abstract, metric-driven approach. And yeah, we've seen this style of leadership in the West for like the last 100 years through the Industrial Revolution, that you end up with these centralized, model-driven approaches to governance, and more often than not, they lead to some form of disaster.
So do you think that the entire basis for ecology is suspect? Because, I mean, the field of ecology suggests that there are decent grips on the way that different species interact, and there's mathematical models, and so the ecological models are the ones that are used to justify the strong interventions. But there are a lot of people that seem to say that, hey, our understanding of ecology is not as good as we think, and just because we have a mathematical model for carrying capacity doesn't mean that that's actually reflective of the real world.
Yes, yeah. I would differentiate science that seeks to study complex systems to, just out of, pure curiosity to figure out what's going on, versus taking those models and applying them on a large scale, particularly when it's done with great speed and on a large scale. I think that's one of the big issues with centralization of control of the application of scientific policy. We have a tendency to find something new and shiny, believe that it's our salvation, and then government jumps onto that and pushes it onto the world before it's ready. I think that's it's a political issue that hasn't been solved yet.
I'm still not convinced that medicine wouldn't benefit from a lot of the extreme high tech.
It's not a question of benefit. I think that it's a question of, will the infrastructure be able to support it? Because what Shane is saying is that in order to do that kind of medicine, you have to do a tremendous amount of sequencing. You have to have a really big bioinformatics platform that is constantly getting new things fed into it so that you can actually differentiate which mutations are harmful, which ones are beneficial. And then there's the people that actually have to do the work. And so if you have a civilization where petroleum is running out, maybe there's 1/10 of the people or 100th of the people working on that kind of stuff in 50 years as there are today. And so it'd still be available, but it's going to be available to the ultra wealthy, not to the every person, right? Because we have this fantasy about biotechnology as being developed for the rich and then being dispersed to the everyman. And that depends on the material basis of our petroleum civilization finding some other functional material basis, which couldn't it be nuclear?
The amount of nuclear fuel that is actually out there, if you wanted to convert wholesale, is not as great, particularly uranium. There's been lots of talk about other systems like thorium reactors. We may have left it too late, is the way I look at it, that with the rate at which things are becoming dysfunctional in society. And at the other extreme, if humans were given the ability to burn hydrogen, to burn water, I could see that leading to greater disasters.
Well, okay, so in a biotech future, though, I can imagine everything photosynthesizing.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, that's still the basis for our, at least, food economy, that though our current agricultural system burns more calories of fossil fuels than it actually produces as food calories in the end. It's a net loss. I think it used to be like 10 calories of fossil fuel energy for 1 calorie of fuel. It's become more efficient. I think it's about 5 to 1 in the current system, but it's basically a system for turning oil into food at a loss. And if you take away those inputs, and even if you can grow the food organically, the distribution infrastructure that moves it all over the planet and makes it very difficult to have local famines, that's all oil-based as well too.
We are supported by audience donations. If you like what we do and you want to support the podcast, come by to patreon.com/demystifysci, where for just a couple dollars a month, you can join our weekly patron chat, you can get episodes early, and you can help us steer the ship, including helping us plan our very first event that we hope to coincide with next year's complete solar eclipse. If you don't have any spare cash and you cannot join the Patreon, that is totally fine. Leave a comment, come to our Discord, send us an email. We would love to hear from you. And more than anything, tell your friends.
I'm still sad because there's some biotech, high tech, like Michael Levin's work, for instance. The idea of being able to get your arm chopped off in a farming combine and have it regrow, something like that, which really excites me. Stem cell therapies really excite me. I've heard a lot of good things about using stem cells to repair the body, especially in old age. And so I just hate to give up on a future that includes those things. That's kind of
Michael Levin's work is actually really interesting because he's working with bioelectricity as a stimulant. And I think it's quite plausible that we would keep some level of electrical technology, but not on a mass consumer scale.
Somebody pointed out to me, and I appreciate this, somebody sent me a link on Twitter the other day to the methods section of one of Michael Levin's papers, and they're not directly applying electrical fields. They're applying chemicals that block the electric fields.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, you said that a couple times on the show, and I didn't want to ruin you were talking about something else, but yeah, he's just chemically modifying the ion channels.
Well, as a counterexample, so a low-tech substitute for something that the world relies on currently, antibiotics rely on pure chemicals, complex synthesis, controlled conditions, and then the distribution of the final products. An alternative to that would be phage therapy that was developed in the old Soviet Union as a branch. And it's extremely effective for many antibiotic-resistant infections. It tends to be a single treatment rather than repeated courses. And it's starting to leak into the West, but the problem is that it doesn't fit into the current drug regulatory framework because it isn't a single pure product. It's a biological mixture of many different strains of viruses. And it works best when it is in that kind of unknown complex mixture, because you never know exactly which phage is going to match the bacteria in the person. Often it's a biofilm, so it's like multiple bacteria working together that are hard to dislodge. So
I worked in a lab one time next to
veterinary science. Oh, sorry.
Oh, what was that?
It's starting to appear.
It's starting to appear in the West in veterinary science because the regulations are less strict.
Yeah, I worked in a lab for a while next to a group that was doing phages for brain tumors, and I don't know. I had never followed up on that work honestly, but I don't have any brain tumors yet, so maybe it works.
But yeah, it's just highlighting that there's all of these possibilities that don't fit nicely into the regulatory framework. They don't fit nicely into the scientific literature. Like if you wrote a paper where it's like, I scraped some mud, I got a mixture of phages, I don't know what's in there, but when I gave it to a patient, their chronic digestive issues went away. But there's no data, there's no mechanism, there's nothing to say in the discussion. That has no place in academia because it's focused on storytelling rather than results.
It makes me wonder if the greatest possible conflict is at this point a regulatory one. Because you were saying at the beginning that it's getting harder to, say, send seeds from Australia to somewhere else. And presumably that's a regulatory thing where they don't want the spread of invasive species. Is that the justification?
Partly that, and also partly pests and diseases that can sometimes stow along with the seeds.
So there's a huge regulatory framework that prevents these things from happening. And how do you have a regulatory jubilee where we're able to maybe roll back some of the things that don't work and find smarter regulations for the things that do work? Because the alternative seems scary.
My personal suspicion is it's just going to be a matter of time before these complex bureaucracies sputter out. Like, they'll still exist in name, but their ability to function will probably diminish over time. But yeah, I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. I mean, we live in a surveillance society at the moment. So yeah, I just do what little I can in my own little corner of the world with the resources I have at hand.
I mean, there was 1,000 years of bureaucracy in China. 2,000 years? So we're just getting started. Like, it seems to me that the system is strong enough to be able to hold on and to just gradually constrict year after year to create narrower and narrower paths for people to travel. Like, there was this really crazy report that was put out by Oxford, Cambridge, University College London, which was called the Fires Report. And in it, they outlined their goals for absolute zero carbon. And by 2050, all shipping lanes close, all airports close, all travel has to be done by rail, all appliances have to be 60% more efficient than they are today. And then after we get down to absolute net zero, then some commerce is allowed to reemerge from the other side. And to me, that's basically a roadmap for an increasingly totalitarian and authoritarian state that recognizes its resource limitation and will do what it can in order to prolong its own life through the application of these rules.
Yes, yeah, and I definitely see a future of techno-authoritarianism as a response to resource shortages. But it's going to be interesting to see how far it can push. I mean, you look at somewhere like North Korea and the amount of resources it takes to keep their population under wraps is a tiny fraction of what we use in the West just to keep ourselves entertained. But at some point, particularly electrical and digital systems, I think have systematic weaknesses. And to be fair, what is happening in North Korea is cross-subsidized by what's happening in the rest of the world. They would be tapping into resources through China, most likely, that allow the elites to maintain their position of power. So yeah, my feeling is that eventually it will disintegrate, but it's a matter of weathering the coming storm.
It's so interesting how high tech seems to lend itself towards authoritarianism in general. Like, you have all of your devices connected to a central infrastructure, which is easy to manipulate. I mean, everybody's going to have electric cars, but California, they're trying to do it in the next few years or something. And at that point, if a cop wants to pull you over, you can probably just tell your car to pull over, right? It's like you get into this or worse, right? If we've been watching a lot of history of the civil rights movement, things like that, and seeing all the assassinations and all the government mucking around. And it seems like the government was involved in a lot of the assassinations in the 60s, though the details are kind of fuzzy. But it'd be pretty easy to just get rid of any dissenters at the point that you can. I mean, it already is at the point that you control the central hub of distribution of their information. But it seems like an inevitability of having interconnection at the same time. Like, all the wonderful things about being interconnected also are wonderful for people who are trying to consolidate power and control information flows, right?
I would actually compare it. I mean, this isn't a new dynamic. So if you look in pre-industrial times, production of iron was centralized and controlled by the elites. But the vast majority of the population were peasants. So if you wanted to be a productive peasant, you had to be cooperative with that power to get access to superior farming tools. You couldn't just say, I'm just going to use a stick and a rock to do my farming, because other peasants would come along with scythes and shovels and better tools and outcompete you. But those same elites would have knights who had horses and armor and weapons that you were completely incapable of resisting. So you were basically in a convenience trap as a peasant. And there were dynamics, there was a limit to how hard the elites could push the peasants without risking massive uprisings, but it was an equilibrium basically that allowed the whole system to hold itself together. And we're in a similar situation. We've got the convenience of digital technology for communication, which allows us to do all sorts of amazing things. But at the same time, it puts us in the sphere of whoever created that digital technology, who controls the supply lines. And we could try and do this like writing letters to each other, which would make us much more indecipherable to power. But our ability to reach other people to find a wider audience would also be much smaller.
Yeah, I was going to say that seems like the hinge, right? Is that the authoritarian structures have access to the information flows and our ability to rally around central issues in one place. But maybe the solution ends up being, like you said, letter writing or local meetings or something that's not easy to interfere with.
Yeah, definitely on a small scale. I also like the idea of constructed languages. So some of them, I think Tokipona is one that I really love. It's only 120 words. It's a minimalist language that you can learn in an afternoon. So, Tower of Babel style, have the population split into smaller and smaller cultural subunits. Because basically I see the global system is like a super organism that is like drawing all of the resources into itself, but at some point it's going to disintegrate when there aren't even enough resources for it to function. And if you look at history, normally what happens is that it fragments and the elites turn on each other at some point, or the central thing lasts long enough until it just fades away and smaller structures appear on the periphery. I always think of the USSR with the people who didn't protest, they didn't do anything particularly dramatic. They just went and grew potatoes on their farm, on their family farm at the edge of the city. And they just got on with small things that they could do to be independent of the system. I don't see any point in fighting the system. You're just going to get yourself crushed like a bug.
What about the other side, the other dream, which is this techno-utopia where there's few people, so the sparsity of resources doesn't matter because they have robots to control all of the hard, difficult processes that you would need the masses for in the past?
I would point out that computers, AI, have gotten very good at doing abstraction, but they're extremely bad at doing mechanical processes and sensing. So I know we have these, the Boston Dynamics robots, like doing impressive feats. But then you see them actually used in the field and they fall over at like the first slippery surface. So human bodies, we like to think of ourselves as being these incredible rational machines, but the things that are really amazing about us are our hands and our eyes. Like AI has like orders and orders and orders of magnitude to go before they can replace something as amazing as human hands.
And the adaptability, right? Like it falls over and it doesn't know what to do. It's like, yeah. I'm not programmed to do anything when I fall over, and nobody's thought of that, or maybe the falling over isn't the same every time, and they don't have that level of adaptability. That's the thing that strikes me about AI when I work with it is it doesn't seem generative at all. It's not coming up with solutions at all. It's not really helping me. It's just assisting whatever solutions I have in mind already.
And yeah, you look at the amount of resources and supply chains necessary to get one of those robots with like a fraction of human capability versus actually just having one human who is obedient and does what you tell them to. There's just no comparison. So
the problem with humans for the oligarchs or for the elites or whatever it is that you want to call them is the fact that they want things. They want comforts, they want treats, they want enough money to be able to buy the things that bring them joy. And if everything is problematic because it is using resources in a way that is uncontrolled and destructive, then you can't have a human population anymore because that population is a risk to your bottom line, which is a garden planet.
Yeah, can we at least agree that there is some sort of wet dream about having fewer people and all of your problems are taken care of by robots? It seems like that's a pretty mainstream dream. I don't know if people are coming out and saying they want to have less humans, but obviously we're on course to have less humans and we're on course to have more machines. it just seems like that is at least one side of the dialectic, right? We can at least agree that that's some future that's being painted right now.
Well, look, okay, so I actually think that all the discourse about AI doomerism and how AI is going to destroy the human species is actually about what it's going to do economically and socially more than it is about taking a hold of some bomber. I think that the AI community is freaking out because they realize that technology that they've developed over the course of the last 20 years or so hasn't really helped people. And so they're seeing these tools, these generative machine learning tools, and they're realizing that where that's going to land. And now they're freaking out, but it's like too late because you can't put it back in the bottle now that you've solved the puzzle.
And yeah, I agree in the short term that AI as a way of controlling information flows is extremely powerful and is going to have a big impact. But I would still argue that in terms of embodiment, it lacks the skills that humans have, and that humans are going to be important in that respect.
But how many people are really embodied in the world today? Like, what fraction of people have manual labor jobs? Do you know? Like, especially in places like the United States, places that have huge levels of consumption, right? Like, United States per capita consumption is one of the highest in the world. I can look this up in a second, but if we were to place bets of what percentage of the workforce is involved in labor stuff rather than soft skills email jobs, what would you pin that as?
In the West, I think we're at like 70-80%, probably service economy.
All right, I'm going to look it up.
The estimate I remember.
It's probably quite variable by location, because most of the people I meet out where we live are doing manual labor of some sort. A lot of tree trimmers and landscapers, contractors.
Tradespeople.
What's that?
Tradespeople. So yeah, the idea of a robot with some form of manipulative ability replacing a plumber is pure fantasy. But replacing a secretary who writes emails and takes phone calls, very plausible.
100%. So I guess
back on the biotechnology, we were talking about hybridization as one of these tools that can survive without industrial infrastructure. So basically, I know personally that there are dozens of projects where I can see the potential for taking existing species, hybridizing them, and producing a new crop. And there's other possibilities for medications as well too, for selective breeding of herbal plants, which has never been done to any significant extent in the past either. The other big technique that people don't realize can be done with low technology is horizontal gene transfer. And we're used to thinking about CRISPR, where we sequence the gene and we have that one gene that we deliberately want to put into the other organism. But you could also do horizontal gene transfer in an agnostic kind of way, basically a mass scale trial and error, and then phenotypic screening, which would allow for serendipity. And you have to do phenotypic screening after CRISPR anyway, because a genome isn't just a bag of DNA. Where that gene goes in the chromosomes actually matters enormously, because we now know that chromosomes form these complex three-dimensional structures when they're actually being read. And it's only something that we've recently figured out, and the tools for measuring that structure are very, very difficult. So it's only been done a couple of times on model organisms. And we basically just toss it in, put a promoter on it, and then hope that it ended up in a region where it's functional. So CRISPR isn't as rational as people like to pretend it is either. But anyway, so the techniques that you can use, so viruses and bacteria move genetic material between multicellular organisms all the time in nature. It's a major driver of evolution. It can happen between plants through mentor grafting. So when you bring two different plant systems into contact with each other, the sap carries exosomes. So the tissues of one of the plants secretes these membrane-bound vesicles that flow and are absorbed by other cells, and they carry heritable genetic elements. So it's a technique that's being developed in Asia, particularly at the moment, and it was hinted at even in Darwin's writings that when plants were grafted together, very occasionally you would see persistent changes in their traits, which couldn't be explained by any of the Mendelian mechanisms that had started to come through. The other one that's really interesting is that sperm uptake naked DNA under the right conditions and incorporate it. So it's a much more convenient way of putting new DNA into a host organism and creating all sorts of unknown possibilities on the other end.
This kind of feeds into, so before we go deeper into the question of hybridization and biotechnology, I looked up the farm payroll. It is 70% of the population is non-farm payroll right now in the United States.
Farm?
Non-farm.
What about non-manual?
Those are also 70% of people work in the service sector.
I see.
And so that's
seems... That's what farm means?
Yeah, it's just like trades and it's not manufacturing jobs generally.
That checks out.
And
but 75% of the population lives in the city too.
Sure. And so it just seems to me that like if we're talking about AI taking over, a lot of those jobs are not dexterity associated jobs. Yeah. And they do tend to be the people that are organizing most highly and most loudly critical of the government. And so it seems like if there is a push in some kind of direction, there's not a lot of material basis for why you wouldn't push for depopulation if you only need 20% of your workforce to actually do the stuff that you need it to do. But
I want to talk about the depopulation thing, but we can finish with the biotech first.
I want to understand. So you just read this book about Lysenkoism.
Yes. Yeah, a couple of them, yes.
Does this tie into the hybridization story and the exosomes and the way that there's surprising permanent genetic changes that occur when we start to mess with animals along paths that are unfamiliar to us?
Lysenkoism is really interesting because it was built on an earlier researcher's work, Maturin, who is very similar to Luther Burbank in the West. He was a self-taught plant breeder who just basically tinkered around with biology and found all sorts of interesting combinations that a formal biologist wouldn't necessarily think to do, and which weren't easy to explain. I mean, there's probably still results in Luther Burbank's many studies that nobody would know how to explain today, but they happened. But yeah, the Lysenko episode was interesting because it was a great example of a political interpretation of science being championed for political purposes and then pushed to damaging extremes. I guess you would say it was a kind of disaster. And I wouldn't be surprised if...
For people who aren't familiar with it, can you give kind of an overview of what it is and what happened?
Yes. So in Soviet agronomy and biology, there was a split from the Western view that genes control biology. So they saw the Nazis take that genetic determinism to its logical conclusion that there are superior and inferior races and we must eliminate the inferior. The Soviet approach was politically opposite to that. They wanted to believe that everyone had equal potential and that a utopia would be formed through creating equality and giving everyone opportunities. So their biology went in a very different direction, going so far as denying the existence of genes became very common. Instead saying that the experiences of an organism during its lifetime created heritable traits that were passed on to the next generation. So that was Lamarckism, I think, was the different style. And it's funny, like that argument and that language forced people to treat it as a dichotomy, that it was either one truth or another, and you ended up with a cultural schismogenesis, that these two groups created their own identity through being the opposite of the people that they interpreted as being their enemies. And I think that caused both camps to go to extremes that they otherwise wouldn't have gone to.
It's like germ theory and
terrain
theory. Yeah, same thing. Yes. Where it's like, and obviously biology, both are happening, guys.
Yeah, pretty much everything is true in biology to some degree, varying at different times. But the way cultures and language and the way we conceive of things tend to work, it seems to naturally divide us into groups that believe opposite things and then attack each other. Maybe this is just how human societies have worked from like the beginning. It could even be a functional response to perceived stress. I've thought about this. Like if you've got a small tribe and they start, experiencing stress because there's not enough food. And some of the members start eating a kind of food that's never been eaten before. The remaining people would say, oh, that's disgusting, you shouldn't eat that. And the group would split along those lines and specialize in different resources, because you don't know immediately whether there's going to be long-term consequences of eating a different kind of food. You could accumulate mutations or parasites or something, but it takes multiple generations for the impacts to be felt. So quarantining your society into two opposing groups with distinct behaviors might actually be a functional adaptation.
It also just seems like it's very difficult to organize your mind. The more causal elements that go into your decision making, it's very difficult to act at that point. I think that's why we prefer these mono values and these single solutions. And of course it plays into tribalism too, but I think there's something just about organizing yourself to will yourself into action that requires you to make these split decisions sometimes. And it's just easier if you only believe one particular causal element in any complex system.
Yeah, I guess it comes down to heuristics. Like there's a limit to how much nuance an individual or a society can include in its communication channels. And I think we see this in the modern internet as well. Like as things get broken down into smaller and smaller form factors, it necessarily forces a kind of digital system. It's either on or off. It's either pro or anti. And that's just kind of the world that we're getting stuck in. Oh, before we move on, though, I really wanted to talk about Eugene McCarthy's work on hybridization, because this was the most exciting thing that I've stumbled across in probably the last decade. So I think I've talked about it a little bit on the Discord, but I would love to go over it here. So Eugene McCarthy is a PhD in genetics who has studied hybridization in vertebrates his whole life. So he's written books like cataloging all of the hybrids that happen in birds. Birds hybridize all the time to create new species. A really good example that happened recently, one of the Galapagos finches got blown to a different island, and it had no mates of its own species, so it mated with a different species, and their offspring created a new hybrid population that has since stabilized into a new species. So it's happened in real time. This isn't hypothetical. So he's also worked in hybridization with mammals, which happens not quite as often as in birds, but there are well-known examples that have happened recently. I think coyotes in the US, there's a population that's emerged in the last 100 years. It's basically of hybrid origin. So he looked at the evolution of humans and noticed that between chimpanzee-like ancestors and the first Homo, there's all of these traits that change simultaneously. There's this big jump in different traits appearing. And he's like, that's really odd. Could that have been the result of a hybridization event? And the idea is that really wide hybridization events between very distantly related species happen much less frequently. So they're very difficult to study in a lab for that reason. You can't just recreate them at will. So he looked at all of the unusual traits that genus Homo had that aren't present in other primates, and went looking for a candidate as the other partner in this hybridization. And the only creature that ticked all the boxes was the pig. So pigs have the same unusual vasculature that moves heat to our skin. They have weird kidneys that humans have, a pyramidal morphology in the kidneys that primates don't have. And you can go to his website. You'll have to find the link for it. Eugene McCarthy. He basically has listed, I think there's 50 unusual traits about humans that overlap with pigs but don't overlap with primates. So the argument would be, where's the genetic evidence? So in his model, that original unlikely hybrid backcrossed to chimpanzees to the point where the genetic influence of the pig was mostly scrambled and erased. So if this happened 2 to 3 million years ago, and there's been multiple backcrossings to chimpanzees, and then a hybrid population stabilized from that, there's reason to believe that there would not be any obvious genetic trace left.
I mean, but that violates pretty much everything that we take for granted about biology, right?
Yes. And you would probably point to chromosome numbers, but he frequently says if you look at established hybridization in mammals, there isn't a close correspondence between chromosome number and whether the hybrids are viable or not. The horse-donkey hybrid creating mules is an unusually infertile example. If you actually look across the whole, all of the mammals, hybrids tend to have reduced fertility, but not zero. There's usually a path through that early genetic scrambling.
Why do you think it violates all of biology? Just because of the species concept?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have a ton of hybrid animals that are easily accessible to us, that are fertile, that we can see. And so if it was something that was really... So with birds, definitely, we actually have a guy coming who studies hybridization in birds, and I think it's going to be really interesting because it does really challenge the species paradigm, where if we have this foundational belief that species are things that can't interbreed, and then you start to look at birds and you're like, oh shit, there's there's a real mess.
Fish too, right? Milton Love first brought this to our attention.
Yeah, definitely.
He didn't seem to be particularly aware of the fact that it was a paradigm shift, though.
No, he was just like, species is kind of a stupid word. Like, it's a word that we use because it gives us the ability to, bin things, but it's not really a word that carries a lot of weight when you start to look at stuff. But I'm like, okay, so human-pig hybrid, weird, but possible. But why don't we have more of them? Did we just not see them?
The way I look at it is, so the Darwinian model of evolution is a branching tree. And when we do phylogenetics, we kind of impose that on this massive bioinformatic information that we have to try and figure out the most parsimonious tree. But there's often little things that don't line up with that. They're just kind of, noise that we sweep away.
Can you give some examples?
Well, it's partly coming down to like the development of models. So like I was looking into this recently, bioinformatics is starting to produce mathematical models that look for hybridization, but rather than it being a branching model, which is much more mathematically simple, it becomes a kind of reticulation, if you know what I mean. Like it's a network of interweaving branches. And the further those branches are away from each other, the less frequently they cross over. So something like a pig-chimp hybrid between different orders, would that be, of the mammals? I mean, that whole Linnaean hierarchy doesn't really mean anything anymore. But those distant crosses happen much more infrequently. And this is an issue for like laboratory science. It relies on reproducibility. And if you, in a controlled setting, and if you propose something like this that only happens in like 1 in a million matings between these really distantly related species, you could go to a laboratory and say, I'm going to like artificially inseminate, 1 million chimpanzees with pig sperm. Nobody's going to let you do that if you say, oh, there's a chance there might be one viable hybrid that comes out of this. I mean, it's similar to the issues with like, geology and
you'd
cosmology.
expect to be able to go into the jungles of Africa and find a boar chimp hybrid, or not even a boar chimp, like something else, right?
I hope to God I never run into a boar chimp hybrid.
I mean, yeah, it really does bring to mind the island of Dr. Moreau, and so you do have to fight against the horror story of what that would be. But if it turned into us, it couldn't have been that bad.
I went on one of my first dates seeing the island of Dr. Moreau, which was a terrible, terrible mistake.
Well, this is the really interesting thing about Eugene McCarthy's book. I'll just flash it at you. I bought it to support him. Telenothians. So this is a catalogue of all of the historical accounts of the mammal hybrids that he could come up with. And there's all sorts of crazy combinations. So if you go back to pre-industrial agriculture with mixed farms, you would have a farm with like 5 different species all living together, which almost never happens anymore. Like you've got mass farms with just one species and controlled breeding. But even as far back as like the 1800s, there's all these accounts in newspapers of like these weird animals being born that look like they're hybrids. He admits it might just be birth defects, it could just be coincidence, but they happen so regularly. And the ones that survived ended up having really weird behavior as well too. And if you go further back than that, In ancient Egypt, there was ritualized interbreeding between humans and animals.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. I was just reading about that last night. All of the Proto-Indo-European religions have a ritual that centers on mating with an animal and then usually chopping it up and taking a bath in its blood or something.
But yeah, so this, and the Romans, for example, have accounts of distant lands like in northern Africa, where they matter-of-factly talk about satyrs, these goat-human hybrids that live up in the mountains. And again, like it's not scientific evidence, but it's not nothing. It's like some kind of hint that there were different dynamics and that there's possibilities like lying in plain sight to do all sorts of crazy things with biology that we just think are impossible, so we don't even try.
Okay, well, so when you're working with plants, especially plants that you're growing, how frequently is it possible to make a weird hybrid versus not?
So a really, really good example of this, because Luther Burbank did his whole life on this. Like I'm only just starting down this road. So he took a single female raspberry plant of a Native American raspberry, which has separate sexes. So he only had the female. And raspberries are in the Rosaceae, which includes pears and apples and plums and quinces and a whole lot of ornamental and like obscure plants as well. And he took pollen from everything in the Rosaceae and put it on this one female raspberry. And pretty much everything produced viable seeds. So he had this like garden of Dr. Moreau of all of these bizarre hybrid plants. Some of them were infertile, but not all of them. I think I recall it was like 20-30% of them could produce their own seeds. What happened to them? I don't know. Like this was like 100 years ago that he did this work. But if you talk to a biologist today, like even like a botanist, an expert in the Rosaceae, and said, oh, could I cross these two, distantly related genera in the Rosaceae? They'd say, oh, no, it's not going to work. Don't waste your time. Like that's the attitude that they would probably have with the way that mainstream biology looks at the potential for hybridization. And
I mean, man,
you just need to try.
Do you think that the smartest people in these industries don't understand this? I mean, that's it's almost hard to believe sometimes when I look at the scientific landscape and I see ideas that are being pushed out of academia or industry, because I'm like, there's no way somebody at the top doesn't understand how things actually work.
When they do understand, there's nothing they can do with it in the paradigm other than like keep an eye out for natural hybrids that they can write papers about discovering. But in terms of just doing this wild, open-ended, serendipitous kind of experimentation, there's no place for it in academia or industry anymore because there's no identifiable goal in terms of a paper or a product.
Yeah, because we have a pretty standard selection of things that you get at the grocery store. And I've seen this with apples, where when there's a new hybrid apple, that it gets trademarked and then it gets marketed and they have these fancy labels. And so they're sold as this product that at least you can convince people to buy because it's an apple and they're familiar with it. But you start showing up with like quince watermelon hybrids, and the amount of effort that you have to put into producing a plant like that, bringing the infrastructure to bear that it actually makes enough that you can get it into the grocery stores. It just seems who has the interest or the mind.
I was thinking more other branches of science, as I often do. I was just thinking about things in astrophysics and things about how the planet works in general, where a lot of the ideas that we discuss on this show, they seem more or less common knowledge to people on the fringe, certain mechanistic understandings about the way these systems work that is clearly not attractive to people inside the academy. And I just have a hard time believing that there aren't some really smart people at the top of the pyramid who understand how things work and just don't want to fund those projects for their own sinister reasons. Full conspiracy theory now, folks.
So I posted a really interesting paper to the Discord, which I love, by the way, about how the academic ecosystem changed around about 1971. I don't know if you saw it. I posted it recently from a wonderful Substack who put together all of this analysis about how play and risk-taking and the way people interact with each other changed dramatically around 1971. And if you look at the broader economy in the Western world, lots of indicators started diverging around that time too. That was the time when conventional oil production in the United States peaked, and the economic system changed, and a whole lot of incentives changed as well too. So
it's also when peer review first really became a thing.
Yeah.
Which was essentially, I just learned this the other day. You might have to, somebody should fact check me if I'm wrong about this, but I can't remember where I heard this on a podcast somewhere.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, watch out. But I heard that Maxwell, of like Ghislaine Maxwell's dad of Jeffrey Epstein fame, that he single-handedly hatched the publishing industry because he realized that that in the university system, he had an enormous market if he could essentially put all of these scientific works, aggregate them, and then sell them to these library systems and make it a renewable cost, right? A subscription service that he could, and he made millions. He came up from nothing, essentially. And that all happened around the same time. I think it really came into its own in the 70s, and, that is...
Academic publishing is definitely a huge parasitic industry, but I don't like explanations that just say, oh, some person made an arbitrary decision at that point in history and they all happen to point in the same direction. My view is that the industrial economy was mostly expanding up until 1970, and it's been in survival mode ever since. And that's where the ultimate origin of this is, that it's a hint that the climate that all of these decisions are made changed around that time. And we can't just reverse, we can't go back to the way things were just by making arbitrary decisions. There's economic realities that make everybody risk averse.
It's always a constellation, right? There's always millions of factors that play out. And of course, nothing happens without the entire universe conspiring to have it happen at the same time.
As an analogy, if you're a farmer who has a crop that if you plant it and everything goes right, you get just enough to keep your village alive, the ability for you to say, I'm going to go off and hybridize these weird plants that nobody's ever eaten before and try making something new, that option shuts down to you.
That makes sense.
You need to live in a world where you have buffers available that you can afford to make these play decisions on the margins. And once you reach a point of constriction, those options shut down. You're basically in survival mode. And I think natural selection tends to push complex systems into these states where everything ends up kind of locked at its local survival maximum, and you get these long periods of stability where species don't change and everything seems to be kind of trapped. And you need something like a meteor hitting the planet to kind of shake everything up. And then you end up with this punctuated equilibrium where you get all of these new experiments tried in the interim for a relatively short period of time. I'm hopeful that in the long run, human society can find a way to maintain these structures of play, that we can, I don't know, maybe the Aztecs did it with human sacrifice, that they kept enough wiggle room, that they weren't on the edge of survival constantly.
Well,
I don't know.
It definitely plays into the publishing landscape, I think, because
human sacrifice.
Sort of. I mean, people martyr themselves to these minutiae careers, right? Because you have to chase this funding source, and you get a bulletin that lists all of the projects heading types that are going to be funded in any given year.
Well, it's a much more competitive landscape than it ever was before, right? Because you're talking about this time in the 1960s, which Robert Maxwell, there's a Guardian article about Robert Maxwell establishing for-profit academic journals. And so, like Elsevier, and he had one that was called Pergamon, but I think that Elsevier is the one that really survived off of it. So, okay. Fact.
He's a weird dude, by the way. Very, very weird dude. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances. He was buried in some particular cemetery in Israel that was reserved for intelligence agents from Israel. Just a weird freaking dude. He changed his name like 20 times or something by the time he was 20. I don't know. He's a very strange guy.
Well, okay. So if you take science to be the tool of the state, which I do, then it makes sense that somebody who's instrumental in shaping the scientific publishing would be of great utility to the state.
Yeah.
Like
It's not
lowest
surprising,
common denominator explanation. But
I mean, it's an industrial gain, and if the state is essentially acting on behalf of industry, it makes sense.
yeah, exactly.
This is why I advocate for forms of science that don't require industrial scale resources and infrastructure. Like anybody can like gather together a few unusual plants and learn how to do hand pollination. Like a lot of the pollination I literally do with my hands. I don't even need tweezers to do it once you understand how the flowers work. And it's basically a matter, like the low hanging fruit is finding a genus that has some history of use, has several species that are available, and then just getting them all in one place and moving pollen around. That seems to be something that, someone in an African village could potentially do.
They could. I think that the only question is what you were saying, which is what's the point? Because from the 1960s, we've progressively industrialized our sciences. There's not Luther Burbanks anymore because what we've decided is that science is much more a tool of government for the sake of producing technologies and whatever else. I think
Industry
and technology.
And commodities.
And
yeah,
commodities.
Like agriculture as a commodity. Yeah.
Exactly. And so if you have a commodity-driven system that is the result of this having reached the high water mark of civilization, then there's not really any likelihood for people to be able to be wealthy enough to just sit around in their yards and do it, because what most people want is they want the goods of civilization. Most people don't want to be farmers in their heart of hearts. If they did, I don't think that we'd have 70% of people working in service industry.
It's interesting though, like our understanding of what life was like for pre-industrial peasants. Do we have an accurate sense of what that lived experience was? So like during the enclosures, like when wealthy landlords were taking over the countryside for more profitable livestock to run, and peasants were being forced into cities and factories. I'm not convinced that that was necessarily an improvement in their lot. Like they used to live in small, tightly knit social groups with support for each other. They did varying work. Like it wasn't just like scything wheat all day long. That was a concentrated, high intensity activity, but aside from that, every individual would have had specializations, like making tools, all sorts of different skills that they rotated between. So it would have been a really diverse lifestyle. And I would argue that they probably were psychologically healthier than the average suburbanite today.
But if that life was so good, why would people have left to go into the cities?
The countryside was basically taken over by wealthy landlords, particularly when mechanized machinery for like harvesting grain came along. The peasants were just not needed anymore, so they were forced out. They didn't go voluntarily.
That sounds very familiar.
Well, that's what people are worried about out here, for sure.
An equivalent thing is going to happen when the intellectual machines colonize the service economy, and people are forced out to a different kind of existence. Is that the analogy?
Or just forced out of existing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we talked about this last time, but to me it seems like every time in the past, the machines have been in need of large numbers of human operators, right? So if you think about the textile mills, the textile mill worked on the basis that you still needed some number of people to run the machines. And so you needed fewer weavers than you would have needed for each person to make the cloth, but still some number of them. And as your technology becomes both mechanized and intelligent, you gradually compress the number of people that you need in order to be able to achieve the same goal. And the question is, what new types of work do you imagine for them? And if you can't imagine a new type of work for them, then do you need the people?
I would say no. And we kind of already see this in the economy today. Like whole segments of the global economy just get cut off when they're no longer profitable. I mean, look at what happened with Sri Lanka. It basically ceased to make economic sense for it to import synthetic fertilizers and export commodities like tea. And the global system didn't say, oh, we have to find something for all these Sri Lankan people to do. It basically just cut it off and turned its back. The British
What happened?
Empire,
I don't know
same
much
thing.
about what happened there. Can you say more?
So yeah, Sri Lanka had, it's been going through civil war and all sorts of problems for a generation or two now. But in recent years, and this is another kind of example parallel to what happened with Lysenkoism. So my understanding is that the government realized they had a balance of payments problem. So they were importing synthetic fertilizers because they didn't have any of their own fossil fuel or factories for doing that. And previously their economy worked by importing chemical fertilizers and pesticides and exporting products like tea. And the price for tea was getting low, the price of fertilizers was getting high. And they realized that they just couldn't keep doing that. So they rolled out an initiative where they said that the country was going organic. They were going to ban the import of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. And the idea was that the tea would then be a premium product. They would get a higher price for it. There'd be more tourism coming to this, wonderful green utopia. In practice, the agricultural outputs plummeted and the economy just completely melted down. And yeah, since the dramatic part of that, I haven't actually seen much news coming out of Sri Lanka, other than it's just become like a daily survival for ordinary people to get by.
So when it comes to the import of industrial agriculture, why can't you use things like night soil and animal manure to fertilize fields? You
can, but it supports a much lower population and economic intensity than you currently have. A really good example of this is a book called Farmers for 40 Centuries. And this is such a rare treasure. So in the 1890s, an American agronomist traveled through Southeast Asia and Japan, and he analyzed how their pre-industrial agricultural systems were working. And Japan was probably like the most intense agricultural system in the world, probably partly because it developed with relative isolation from the mainland. So its need to invest in its military was a bit lower, partly because it relied so much on seafood. So most of its protein actually came from the ocean, and that provided a constant stream of minerals and nitrogen that would then overflow into their rice production. But even still, Japan could only support, I think it was 1/3 of an acre of rice per person, and that's shrunken down with industrial inputs to, I think it's about 0.05 of an acre per person. So this is the reason why we have 10 times more population now than we had before industrialization. And that number at around 500 million people was stable for thousands of years before we hit this kind of inflection point and the population just went vertical in the last century or two.
And the population going vertical in the last century or two is attributed exclusively to increased agricultural production?
Yes.
So at the very least, there's a period of time before industrial agriculture where things suck for the peasants, because they're always bumping up against the fact that it's the population, right? This is the Malthusian crisis that they were so worried about in the 1800s.
And typically the way the dynamic would work is once every 5 years, you would have a crop failure, but you would have enough grain stored that you'd be able to, squeak along. You'd probably lose some of your old people, a few more babies might die because you had just poorer nutrition. But once every 25 years, you would have 2 crop failures in a row and you would have a proper famine. And that's when you would lose more substantial numbers of your elderly and your children. And that basically acted as an equilibration between the carrying capacity and the population. And interestingly, when you get the big chaotic sequences in history is when you go a long period of time of good harvests and the population gets closer and closer to that breaking point. And often that overflows in wars where you just have population nowhere to go. Oh, another dynamic I talked about in my blog recently is that cities have been demographic sinks for most of civilization. So 90% of your population lives in the rural hinterland. And when there are too many people produced in the rural hinterland, they move to the cities out of desperation. And once they get to the city, they're almost certainly not going to be able to reproduce. So the cities actually function like predators in the human ecosystem. That changed when industrialization came along because you could transport food into cities at rates that you never could before. I see industrialization mostly most critically dependent on changes in transportation. In the same way as that you need a circulatory system to produce an organism as complicated as a human being. Without it, you get trapped at something about the size of a flatworm. And yeah, the likely crunch point going forward is going to be transportation. Electrifying transportation on a freight scale is something that doesn't make physical sense. Like batteries are so big and so heavy and so low in energy density that if you try and do trucks or freight ships based on them, it just doesn't make sense. Like 2/3 of your cargo is the battery.
Nuclear freight ships make sense, so right? They have nuclear aircraft carriers and stuff.
That could work. That could tide us over. And I'm not forecasting immediate doom. I think there's a lot of fat in the system that could be cut out. In some ways, the profligate consumption in the West has acted as a buffer that our lifestyles could be cut back dramatically to free up resources to keep the bare minimum going along.
So it seems... So I want to talk about overpopulation. Can we talk about overpopulation?
Yeah. Yep.
So it seems like, first of all, the world is being depopulated actively, passively, I guess is the right way to put it, right? It seems like birth rates are falling off in developed countries for the most part, but projections are that developing countries are going to continue to have huge population booms for the next century, something like that.
I would point out they're the same people who were projecting that the West would continue to expand for longer, so I don't actually trust their models and their incentives.
Wait, you're talking about the UN?
Demographers in general. What are they called?
Industrial funded scientists.
Well, I mean, there's one way in which I can create a frame that you could trust them, which is that people like Paul Ehrlich have since the 70s been saying that we're doomed, depopulation needs to happen because we're, at the limits to growth, the population bomb, all these things. And there's evidence that they were doing it, right? So there's a sterilization campaign in India where they sterilized like 8 million people or something like that. And so when we have the reports that the demographics are starting to decline, that could very well be a reflection of policies that have been enacted and are being actually seen now, right?
Yeah, that's the question. Is this a concerted effort, or is it just the inevitable outcome of the civilization that we've built for ourselves? Or both?
It's tricky because we've only got the past to look on with decent data sets, and that was a period of expansion up until recently for whereas climactic issues, like the economy was vigorous enough and had enough spare resources for long enough that most of our data is from that period of expansion. And we're only just starting to get a hint of how rapidly things can turn around in the other direction. And the only large-scale policy that was implemented that I know about was China's one-child policy. And it was an unusually large, unusually authoritarian state compared to anywhere else in the world. So, even India is quite chaotic by comparison versus places like Nigeria. When you start to see signals of decreasing birth rates in somewhere like Nigeria where there isn't a clear top-down government influence, I think it's a big flashing light that people are adjusting the way they conduct their reproduction, and that can change very rapidly.
There's a pretty strong NGO influence in places like Nigeria, though, right? So I think that the way that I understand the arc of decreasing birth rates is that birth control comes online in the West, and women, if given a choice, predominantly would prefer to have fewer numbers of children later in life.
Yes.
Certainly there are some women that want to have as many kids as possible in their 20s, but generally when you give them the choice, that's how it shifts. And as birth control becomes viewed as a human right, and then it gets distributed throughout these developing countries by non-governmental organizations, then you have increased access to education, birth control, and you have decreasing birth rates. So it is kind of top-down and not incidental.
Yes. Yeah. No, I do agree. But I think the ultimate decisions are driven by economics, by people's awareness of how many children they are likely to be able to support with the spare resources they have to hand.
Yeah, mine are. That's definitely what drives my reproductive strategies.
I mean, I think that it's also lifestyle. Like, I think that there is a media landscape that doesn't have a lot of children in it. Like, if you look at the way that children are portrayed in movies, they're not necessarily centerpiece, and there's not these massive narratives about how fulfilling it is to have children and how wonderful it is. Like, there's children that are probably peripheral, but that's not really the stories that we tend to tell ourselves. And so it makes perfect sense that if that's not the central value of the civilization, which it doesn't seem to be, that you'd get a lot fewer people having children just as kind of normal business.
I would actually grant that point. And I mean, we've lived through a period in history where the ability for mass media to shape public opinion has been amply demonstrated. So, yeah, I think you have a point there. It definitely could be something that's driven through cultural mechanisms as much as anything, because so much of our culture comes from centralized authorities, for want of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, I found the blog that in the 1970s, Gandhi's regime forcibly sterilized 6.2 million Indian men as a direct result of...
Without them knowing about it, right?
Well, I don't know about that specifically. I can look into it. But this is a direct result of the liberal, like, Stanford biology chair who's like, you know what, we got too many brown people. We need to find a way to force them to reproduce less. And he was in his... Have you read The Population Bomb?
That sentence just got us taken off.
No, he's a chair.
I think I read it a long time ago, so the details have faded.
Well, it's crazy because it's Paul Ehrlich. He's an endowed chair of the biology department at Stanford. I think he's an emeritus professor at this point, but he's basically like, okay, there are too many brown people being born, and we clearly cannot reason with them, and so we're going to have to start putting contraceptives in the water, start cutting off monetary aid if they won't control their own populations, and find ways to force their hand. And it seems so horrific when you read it, and then you look deeper and you're like, oh, wait a second, I think that they actually did start to implement this because it was viewed as being foundationally important for the civilization because they wouldn't get aid. They wouldn't be supported by the West the way that our current economic system demands that they are.
It didn't start there either, right? Our country anyways has a long history of eugenics programs, particularly with the mentally ill and prisoners and things like this. So it's not a new idea. I guess the question is, if you were an evil overlord, would this be something you'd be interested in?
If I was an evil overlord who had studied history, I would understand that bureaucracies are really, really bad at implementing policy, centralized policy on a mass scale. I'm a big believer in distributed decision making and allowing. And see, this is the really interesting thing. If you look at the history of what you could broadly consider eugenics, it isn't new. The thing that is new is the mass scale and the centralization and the lack of feedback between what's happening where it's applied versus the theory behind it. Like it becomes imposed and monodirectional and blind to the consequences of its action just because of the scale. It's like that myth of dinosaurs being so big that their nerves couldn't get transmissions to the tips of their tail. The organisms become too big to become integrated. So anyway, going back to the idea of history, humans have done eugenics forever, but we do it on a small scale. So when you choose a partner and you're trying to choose the best partner possible, that's eugenics. That's a form of positive eugenics. When you live in a small tribe and one of the young males shows uncontrolled aggression, it's very common for them to not come back from a hunting trip. And everyone says, oh, there was this horrible accident. They fell off a cliff. No, the older men recognized and had a culture of doing negative selection on individuals that had the potential to tear the tribe apart. I suspect a similar thing happens in traditional societies where women past reproductive age are accused of being witches or evil influences. So much of this seems to happen at a subconscious level as well. A really good example of this is the Rwandan genocide. So, and I'm not an expert in this, I might be wrong, but I read a source that analyzed what happened. So, like most places in Africa, Rwanda experienced massive population growth. They had a culture where their subsistence farms were split evenly between all of their surviving children. Like other places, it will all go to the oldest child. But Rwanda had this culture of splitting farms. So they reached the point where every family was trying to survive on a tiny, tiny scrap of land, which was barely enough. So the whole society was at a breaking point. Then we ended up with, from the outside, what is often framed as a racially or a ethnically motivated genocide, that there were two distinct groups that turned on each other. Catalyzed by mass media, radio was a really important part in getting everyone thinking the same way. But when you actually dig into what happened on a local level, there were a lot of cases of people on the same ethnicity killing each other in the middle of the chaos. And the argument was that this was motivated by people's recognition that they didn't have enough land to survive on. And you might have had a neighbor that is of the same ethnicity that you've had a long-running dispute with over something trivial. And when the chaos breaks out, there's an opportunity for you to settle those scores and free up that land for your family to claim if you come out on top. So it was a much more complicated process, but the way it unfolded, it's almost like quorum sensing with microbes, like that they release these signals to each other about the level of stress and the incentives, and you can get phase changes in the behavior of complex systems with or without industrial level communication that coordinates things. I think that just has the potential of taking things to extremes on larger scales at higher speeds than previously happened in history.
Yeah, the cultural necessity for people to behave a certain way is pretty apparent. So you're talking about a culture where the farms get split with every generation, and so you end up at this crisis point. But I can imagine a situation where farms don't get split, but you have large families and only, say, the older son gets the land, but you still have a family where you have 5 other sons. Like, where do those people go? Some of them die in war, certainly, but you still gradually have a larger and larger population with each generation where you have these loose people that aren't attached to the land. And I think that they're the ones that end up in the cities. Like, I think that there was a pressure. Yes. There was a pressure to leave the countrysides and to go into the cities that has led us to where we are now, that it just doesn't seem possible to roll back the clock. Like, I have this feeling where it is possible that things will collapse and that we will not be able to get nuclear power, even though, again, biased source, but the nuclear power advocacy group is like, we have enough uranium on Earth to power humanity's energy needs for the next billion years. Let's say they're an order of magnitude off and it's just a million years. I guess it's not an order of magnitude off at that point. But the point is that 3 orders of magnitude. 3 orders of magnitude, thank you. We have the left brain and the right brain. But you have enough to maintain the society, but I think that there is a pressure for the release of pastoralism because it seems like a simpler time. Like, we have a friend who's way into the 1970s, and to a degree that they're kind of willfully ignorant of everything that happens in the world today. And they're very effective at carving out a life for themselves where they don't have a cell phone, they don't deal with social media, they don't do any of the things that modern people do, and they live just fine. And I think that...
He has a flip phone.
He has a flip phone. Okay. So he's got some fraction of the technology that we use, but I can tell that there's this deep anxiety because he's part of a world that isn't going in that direction. Everybody else looks at like living on a farm and is like, I don't want to breed chickens.
Well, it brings up an interesting thought because those traditional societies, functional pre-industrial societies with surplus population, had other highly effective mechanisms for absorbing that resource. So one possibility is you put them in the military, and when they get a bit rowdy, you send them off to some location to die. And I I'm not a historian that's an expert in this, but I suspect that elites used wars as a way of burning off surplus population as an alternative to having a civil war. Like it's a preferable option. Another structure that's been present in many societies is monasteries. So you take a significant proportion of young people and you put them into these religious institutions, which serve all sorts of functional roles in society. Like the medieval monasteries did all sorts of key economic roles. They weren't just sitting around chanting all day. I suspect that something like that could happen in our future, where there's lots of people. It doesn't actually take a lot of resources to keep people alive and content, but you do need to give them some structure and purpose. And it could be a lot cheaper than putting people in prison, for example.
Yeah.
The per person per
How
day
about the
cost of
CCC
prison
again, right?
is off the charts.
Oh.
But a monastery,
Well, they had this incredible program back in the 20s and 30s, was it?
Yeah, during the Great Depression.
oh yes,
Great
yes, yes.
Depression, right? I mean, so many.
Shiloh really, really wants to put people to work.
I mean, I think that it would have been incredible when I was 18 to have gone for a couple years and built some paths in the woods, or built some cabins and restored some of the parklands, or repaired the bridges that are all but falling down around our country right now. And honestly, the CCC gave them a salary. It gave them the opportunity to mingle with other young people. And come on, when you show up at college when you're 18 years old, you don't know what you want to spend the rest of your life studying. It's kind of a disservice to fling people into this extended adolescent experience, I think. And I would love to see something like that happen again. I honestly think that if a presidential candidate ran on that platform, that they would win in a landslide, no matter what party they were in.
I love the idea, but I'm cautious because of the current climate that creates parasitic bureaucracies. So the actual implementation of these programs and getting the resources to the people who need them at the end of the layers of bureaucracy, that's the thing I wonder if our society has lost the ability to do.
Yeah, it seems like your model boils down to parasitism in general, because you're like, well, it's not necessarily that depopulation is being organized from the top down, but it does seem like there's some parasites at the top that find that convenient in some sense. Would you agree with that?
And yeah, probably the best path forward is for small groups of people to come together with the purpose of becoming a parasite of the ailing industrial system, with the long-term plan of decoupling from it when absolutely necessary. But in the short term, the idea of going back to pre-industrial, like the globe is dominated so much by this system. You even see like hunter-gatherers in like remote South Africa saying that their survival is more difficult than it was even a few generations ago because of that influence, that leviathan straddling the world.
Well, the climate is definitely changing, and that's something that is going to make things difficult. And you can point to whatever it is that you want. You can point to solar activity, a decreased magnetic field, the shifting magnetic pole, cosmic rays, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's that we don't have the same conditions on Earth that we did 50, 100 years ago relative to the burden on the planet. And we've definitely depleted a huge number of the resources. Like, we live in the Pacific Northwest, and so there's all this, the salmon runs. Salmon runs used to be massive to the degree that you could see the wave of fish coming up the river as they arrived. And now, I mean, there's some, but most of the rivers are stocked by fish that are grown by the humans. And so there's definitely a decrease in just the stability and resilience of nature. And it seems like that might actually be chemical contamination. Like, I really think that the waste products of the industrial civilization are not limited to the place where they're deposited. And so I feel like if I have a biological model for this, then it's an organism that's producing so much waste that it is building up and it is preventing the superorganism of the human species from reproducing, and will force us into a mode of degrowth where we have less because there's not enough people to run the machines that are necessary to give us the standard of living that we're used to. And so it's like an inevitable decrease, and then it'll stabilize at some lower population, and then it'll start to go up again. And so we're just going to oscillate for as long as we can around some set point.
Yeah, what are the stats for infertility right now? Do you know anything about that?
I can look. What specifically?
I'm just curious how infertile humans are now compared to 50, 100 years ago.
Let me look.
Humans are naturally a really low fertility species, which is apparently another sign that we have a relatively recent hybrid origin, that our reproductive systems are still not particularly functional. But that's
what do you mean? You mean you have to? What do you mean by that? You mean a lot of individuals can't have babies, or individuals have to mate many times before they have babies?
Yeah, so for most mammals, if they mate once, it's successful. For humans, I think on average we have to mate 8 times.
Is that just because we don't know when to do it?
No, even if you do it with the correct timing, most of the embryos that are created are non-viable. Because our genetics is like, we're incredibly inbred, like compared to like on the order of pandas, except there's 8 billion of us. So yeah, we're in a really weird, we function a lot like an ant nest or a termite mound, in that we're a large number of very, very closely related individuals on a scale that no other mammal comes close to.
I didn't know that. It makes sense though.
But yeah, all the stuff about like declining sperm counts and all this, I'm not that convinced by the data. Like we're using sperm counts from like the 1800s as part of our data set. Like I'm not going to take that seriously. And also a lot of the practical drop in fertility in the West.
Wait, sorry, why did you say that you weren't going to take it seriously? Sorry.
The data was old, he said, but I'm thinking about data from the 1970s versus now or something. We've had this statistic on the show before.
Sperm counts has changed several times in that data set. So yeah, I'm not particularly worried about it. A broader issue though is like, why do we need 8 billion people on the planet? Did anyone set out to achieve that, or was it just an accident? And if it goes back to like 300 million, is that necessarily a bad thing?
Well, we don't have any of the trappings of modernity at that point, right? We don't have the Zoom calls and the plastic packaged foods at the grocery store and the supply chains and the telecommunications and the roads. And, you know, there was an article that I was reading. Somebody wrote about how long it takes to drive between two cities in the British countryside. And it's the same distance between 2 American cities. And between the 2 American cities, you have the highway system. And so you can make the drive in an hour and a half, but it's a 5-hour drive through the winding roads of the British countryside. And so if you have a decrease in population, you lose all of the trappings of modernity, I think.
I would make a counterpoint though, if it turns out that we could only maintain this industrial civilization for a century or two, versus what could you achieve with 300 million people if it was relatively sustainable for thousands, tens of thousands of years. What other possibilities are opened by that? Particularly if you go back to a dynamic where play and serendipity can find its way back into whatever they call science. I think you could actually achieve vastly more in that dynamic. And why are we in a hurry? Like, why do we need to come up with these breakthroughs so quickly? We've got how many million years left on the planet?
Well, okay. So,
assuming you believe that model,
I think that it's in part important because humans have always had slaves. Everything that has been built on the backs of slaves. And now we have wage earners in the countries that have rights, and so they're no longer slaves, but we still have slaves that are behind the scenes. You know, the migrants that pick the food, the people who work in the Congo mines to get cobalt, that are not protected by whatever, you know, generic human rights we claim. The goal of acceleration is to move past that. And so in the utopian dream of the machines are open source, machines are aligned, and the machines obviate the need for slavery, which is something that has been with humans since time immemorial. They also A one world government means that nobody's fighting over resources. It means that you've ended war. It's the most utopian project that you can possibly imagine, where people can live this pastoral lifestyle where they're supported by universal basic income. They have enough money to be able to buy the things that they want. Like, I think about irrigation all the time. Like, obviously you're working on zero input agriculture, but if we didn't have hoses to get the water out of our, like if we had to go and get the water out of our well by hand every time that we wanted to water something, that would be what we did. There wouldn't be time for intellectual labor, because this time and space-saving devices of modernity are the things that make the activities liberating as opposed to oppressive, right? Because I don't know how much intellectual progress the English peasant had, and I like intellectual questions.
So I would maybe suggest that civilization as it came together is this cobbled together, it's this cobbled together agglomeration that relies on the adaptability of humans to like fill in all of the gaps. So you end up with these, what would you call them? These absurdities of like peasants spending most of their life, grinding grain until their shoulder joints like wear away to feed their family as this kind of makeshift solution. But it's an optimization trap, because if you look at the superior crops from the New World, they develop things like corn, where you don't need to grind it when it's hard. You have a completely different process that uses ash to soften the grain and do all of the hard work for you. So my suggestion would be that in the longer term, we could come up with biological solutions that mean that humans don't have to do everything to hold the ecosystem together with our bare hands.
I mean, I'll give you that, okay, right? Because it seems like right now our systems are so labor intensive that the only thing that we can do is work as hard as humanly possible, as fast as humanly possible, to keep them from shaking apart, right? Most of the things that we consume are the product of reproduction, but we don't think about it in context of that, right? You buy the steak from the grocery store and you're not thinking about the massive industrial machine that governed the biology, not even just the bodies of those animals, but the biology and the reproduction of those animals in order to get you that piece of steak. So, okay, I'll give you that. We're white knuckling it. But it seems like if you point to Mesoamerica and you're like, look, they figured stuff out, they also practiced horrific human sacrifice and cannibalism rituals, which the Europeans cannibalized. There's this whole medical industry of medical cannibalism where they would chop up bodies. They'd put them in pills, and so it was a very different, puritanical way to approach human sacrifice and cannibalism. But one of the things that is a benefit of the society that we have today is that we have these rules where we're like, look, we've agreed that these are the values by which we ought to live. And I kind of like those values. I don't think that most people live by them. But if you look at the
Give me an example.
Of the values that I like?
Yeah.
The Ten Commandments. What was that?
No cannibalism.
No cannibalism, but even the Ten Commandments, right? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not be gluttonous. I don't remember the other ones. The shalts. And so I'm like, those are good things. That is a good program that we have created, that we have maintained. I try to live by those rules as best as I possibly humanly can, and I feel like any destabilization of the culture is inherently a break from those mores, because we've been following them for, if you take the Old Testament, for like 5,000 years.
Yeah.
Well, they're older than
that. And in complex systems, changing the abstract rules leads to unanticipable consequences and unintended consequences, which makes it a very difficult system to evolve, particularly on a mass scale. If you have a global system, its ability to innovate ends up restricted. So, for example, a modern equivalent that I've often thought about as an equivalent to the human sacrifices that the Aztecs used for managing their civilization. What if you had a maximum lifespan? Like across the board, when people reach X years of age, everyone gets euthanized.
Midsummer.
So
Oh my god.
but that sounds horrific to us because, and I think rightly so, we're cautious of it because it would represent a fundamental change in the social contract. Who knows what would come from it? But the way that you could introduce it through gradualism would be to set it initially at an extremely high level. So what about 100 years old? Almost nobody gets to 100 years old. Most people at 100 years old are like, yeah, I've been ready to go for like the last 20 years. And they're often very agnostic about living or dying. Then if you had a democratic process where you can change that by plus or minus 1 year every year through referendum, that would allow you to find where that optimum equilibration point is. And the generations would have time to culturally acculturate, to equilibrate with that new possibility. So if you were born and you knew that everybody died when they hit 70, would that be horrific, or would that just be something that you take into account in your worldview? It just becomes part of your worldview. I mean, the Aztecs who were sacrificed saw it as a great honor. Like they weren't running and screaming unless they were a recently captured part of the empire that was brought into that culture. But there are reports of people who saw it as a great honor.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think
selected to be sacrificed.
I think that sacrifice is a really important thing, actually. I think that's why, I think that this actual phenomenon of human sacrifice and killing of animals and so forth was ceremonial because it represents something that's much more important. It's celebrating the little sacrifices that are absolutely necessary every day to the little sacrifices that are necessary every day in order to bring you into a better place, right? You have to sometimes admit that you're wrong in an argument, right? That's a sacrifice. Or if you make a mistake, or if you could do something better, right? These are little tiny sacrifices that you're making all the time. And by celebrating the act of sacrifice, you're centering that as a cultural value. I think it goes much deeper. There's a really incredible podcast series by Daryl Cooper on Martyr Made about this, and he explores the origins of it. And anyways, I highly recommend that.
So yeah, I think we're likely to go through a period of cultural innovation. A lot of it will be fueled by desperation. And the Lysenkoism is a great example of authorities latching on to the most sellable policies, the ones that promise the most, even if it wasn't based on even a scrap of reality or evidence. And I mean, Make America Great Again is probably an echo of that idea that, I mean, it's one of the dangers of democracy, basically, is that you have to convince people to support what you are intending to do as a first step. And there's a limited bandwidth for those messages, and there's a competition between parties who are trying to promise the most amazing thing. So yeah, I think that's a real danger going forwards, that we could end up, particularly the idea of a green authoritarianism, that justifying these mass programs, these top-down imposed programs with a green coat of paint on them, basically to make them palatable and acceptable. I see that as a potential danger too.
Well, we were talking about this the other day in context of fishing, where we were like, okay, so you're a small country and you want to protect the waters off of your coast in order to be able to fish cleanly. I think that somebody was telling us about how it was the Cook Islands that had made a law that no international fishing vessels could come and fish in their waters.
Shout out Stefan Rotzel.
Oh yeah, we had a friend who made a documentary about it. And that's fantastic. Agency of a small nation that is able to stand up to these global powers, but then you start looking into it and you're like, okay, in order for that to be possible, there has to be a policeman that is able to come in and to make consequences for somebody fishing in those waters without permission. And so you really quickly end up at a model which is that, okay, well then you do have to have a one world government type of situation where everyone agrees on the rules, everybody agrees in, these green agency self-determination principles, and we all give our vested authority into this one system and accept that it can't change.
And rely on the central authority not being colonized by special interests like corporations.
That's the crazy
thing. That seems to be at the heart of all of this.
It has to be, because it's like, okay, so people are really freaked out about AI, but I think that what they aren't realizing is that corporations are basically already autonomous, intelligent programs, and we have utterly
100%.
failed at aligning them to our interests.
Yeah.
And so it really makes me feel like what we're having a conversation about isn't purely about AI. It's a question of how do we get autonomous systems to be aligned to human interests in a way that they've never been before, because it's always been about something that is inhuman. It doesn't have a head. It's just this agent.
Interesting you mentioned about fishing too, because do you know about the link between infectious disease severity and nutrition?
I would assume that the lower your quality of nutrition, the higher the incidence of infectious disease.
Absolutely. So a really good example of this is measles. So in children that have adequate protein intake, measles is usually a relatively mild condition. But when you are facing protein insufficiency, measles transforms into a much deadlier condition, which also translates it into it becoming more infectious. So measles epidemic is often a symptom of a breakdown in the economy in terms of nutrition. And particularly protein is a critical ingredient in immune system function. So currently, world protein supply, a significant chunk of that is wild caught from fisheries, which are collapsing one after another, and which rely on cheap petroleum to power these megaships that go out and scrape up the last little bit of protein left in the ocean. So as a driver of population decline in the future, I see the most likely thing being infectious disease, and not novel ones. I mean, there's plenty of old candidates that are still in the wings in places that people don't think about very often, and that are mostly being held back by nutrition and sanitation and to some degree vaccinations and antibiotics, a combination of all of those things. And each of those systems is already showing signs of decay. So sanitation systems were often built so long ago that they're starting to disintegrate. I mean, the US, your water system, I think, is facing major issues across the board, and where the resources are going to come to maintain that infrastructure, nobody seems to know. The antibiotic supply chains are now going through India and China to minimize costs, but that is causing supply chain disruptions whenever things have a bit of a hiccup. Vaccines, at least the traditional ones, often rely on cold storage chains, and they already have difficulty getting to remote locations that don't have reliable electricity. And yeah, as I said, the protein, a big chunk of it comes from the oceans. The rest of it comes from crops which depend on synthetic nitrogen inputs. So
there's also the mismatched nutrition, right? We saw that with the recent plague, which shall go unnamed. It seemed like I don't know the stats, of course, as usual, but I believe the majority of severely affected patients were obese. And that's very different than being undernourished, right? It's a malnourishment, but it's a very bizarre one.
It's partly a consequence of, and this goes way back, agriculture is much better at producing carbohydrates than it is at producing fats and proteins. And that's an issue that goes way back to the dawn of agriculture, when hunter-gatherers that previously had much more diverse food intakes moved into a system which was predominated by carbohydrates. And we adapted to some degree. Part of that involved becoming shorter and more delicate, and having a few health impacts. But the very, very early fossils that are pulled out of like the first people who were living mostly off barley looked like they were in pretty horrific condition. Something similar probably happened when humans first started eating a large amount of dairy. But look at it this way, like even further back, the amylase copy number in various hunter-gatherers increased massively. It's like the most variable gene in the human race. Some hunter-gatherers still have like one amylase copy and others have 30. So they can digest starch so much more efficiently than other people. It's funny, like if the modern human diet, the industrial westernized diet, kept going for long enough, we probably would end up adapting to a point where the individuals who are more likely to become severely obese from it and have health consequences gradually got weeded out of the population from just not being able to reproduce. But yeah, it's a temporary blip, so all of that suffering won't account for very much.
I mean, it's a pretty grim picture that you're painting. Were you going to say something? You had thoughts. Tell me. Tell us.
I mean, I'm curious how you think this all played out in the last 5 years on our planet.
Oh, anything specific?
Well, really just with the nutritional basis of infectious disease and how, all right. If you look at the response that came to the world, this idea that we have to develop a medicine to deal with this fixation on medicine as the solution. Of course, you could say, well, this is just entirely industrially driven, but it seems to be a mindset, right? It seems to be also bottom up in that people want that pill to solve their depression. They want that pill to make them grow muscles. They want that ease of fix to the solution. And I feel like that played out heavily at the cost of not really paying attention to solving the problem, which could have had, we could have had a very real solution set that involved nutrition and involved exercise as a nation, right? But that's such a fantasy at the same time, because that's not what the modern culture is really about. I'm curious to what extent you think that was parasitized by industry, and to what extent it was just an inherent feature of where we're at in civilization right now, in our urge to get comfort and do things the easy way.
I think it's partly just a symptom of overshoot. So a really good example of this with nutrition is what happened before and after the World Wars. So before the World Wars, human fat intake was, I think, around about 30% of calories, but it was mostly from animal fat. So lard, fatty meat, dairy, that was the predominant source of fat calories. After World War II, when there was a massive explosion in population numbers, the previous agricultural system couldn't produce that kind of fat anymore, and it substituted it with plant-based fats. So seed oils is like now the major source of fat in people's diets. And the reason why they'd never been used before is that they oxidize in air once they're extracted and turn rancid. So if you wanted to make a seed oil previously, you had to use it basically straight away. It was just grinding up the fatty seeds and eating them. But after World War II, chemical antioxidants were produced that could stabilize these oils so that they could be produced on the farm and then transported long distance into the cities. And nutritional science today is such a mess, but there are many people who think that the seed oils are contributing to at least some of our current health issues. And
well, sugar too, right? You can't ignore sugar.
Oh yeah, sugar's a major one as well too. And the reason why we refine sugar is because it becomes cheaper and easier to transport. And when we make processed food, a uniform industrial commodity input is much easier to incorporate into that process than, live fruit that will, squash and go rotten.
Well, it gets you
So
high
a lot of
too,
this-
right? Sugar feels good. People love that.
Oh yeah,
like
yeah,
that kick.
absolutely.
And I mean, it's
If
crazy
you
if you
took
go
the
to.
sugar out of processed food, people wouldn't eat it.
That's what I'm saying. If you go to even like Trader Joe's or something, I don't know, even like Whole Foods, and you start looking at the back of these prepared packages, good luck finding something without sugar. If you want to get some without sugar, you got to pay extra for it. It's really astounding.
I think that the secret is also natural flavors.
Oh yeah.
This is my favorite. This is my most recent favorite thing to kick.
Well, it's interesting because this isn't a completely new dynamic. So, for example, bread production, we have this view of like peasants, like, spending the morning making bread in their own kitchen. That was actually relatively rare. Like most villages would have a centralized bakery and a centralized mill. And you would grind the flour up and the oil would start going rancid. You'd have to use it immediately. And the baker had a mix of incentives. So if they could, what's the word? If they could contaminate the flour with something cheaper and get away with it, they could potentially make more money and be richer. But he would be living in the same village as the people that he's selling the bread to. So the people buying the bread would want it to be as high quality as possible so that their children didn't become protein insufficient and die in the next plague. So they have aligned incentives there, but the baker doesn't necessarily share those incentives because they're not his children. The only thing stopping him from adulterating the flour is the villagers finding out about it and burning his house down and like killing him. And that happened quite often. Like people would be caught releasing, dodgy products into the food system, but there would be a rapid form of accountability. In our industrial system, we're so far away from the factories that make our food that level of accountability has mostly gone. And any attempts we make of dealing with that immediately get co-opted by marketing. So if we suddenly think, oh, this new thing is healthy, I want that, now the system has an incentive to make us believe that it's delivering that health benefit when it's actually cutting costs as much as possible.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm really terrified by is that you can't actually drag a corporation out into the street and lynch it. Right? I mean, you can't even put a corporation on trial and put it in an electric chair. You can't even put a corporation on trial and put it in jail. But the consequences of their malfeasance are just as bad as any bad actor in the past, except they're amplified in scale. And that's something that I think we really have to figure out. I mean, I'm always saying, like, it seems feasible to me that you could put corporations in jail, like absolutely lock up their assets, and people wouldn't invest in corporations that had a history of going to jail. But I don't know if that'll happen.
Well, it has happened in the past, but I think we live in an age where we're close enough to the edge of survival that parasitism goes unchecked. And to use a biological analogy, it's like an organism that has reached a stage of senescence where it no longer tries to stop the tumors from growing and the worms from burrowing through it. It's basically just running on momentum of everything that's come beforehand. So it's funny, like the idea of industrial civilization dying doesn't actually fill me with horror because the alternative of this continuing indefinitely is far more horrifying. If you continue the trends that we've put into motion, even without them continuing to grow, the consequences are far more horrifying. And living through a period of collapse and decline and contraction isn't necessarily going to be the most fun thing. But yeah, again, like there's opportunities for us now to create just little things that have the potential to survive and come through the other side and contribute to the next civilization that's coming after. I mean, think about the people who took the time to copy Roman manuscripts by hand through the Dark Ages when, they could have been doing things for their own survival. That capacity to value things that have enduring influence, I mean, it's already happened, and I think it's going to happen again. And I would encourage people alive today to think about what is worth grabbing from this burning building and dragging out into the grass to
Yeah, I'd like to see some electricity persist into the future. I think electronics are really useful. I mean, that's an understatement, but just in terms of agriculture, in terms of running our own little garden here and being able to automate systems, I find that to free a ton of time. I don't have to water my plants every single morning, right? There's all these little tiny things that I think
I would
could
suggest
persist.
finding plants that don't need watering.
Man, you haven't seen our
That's the
climate out
obvious.
here. We live in the desert, basically.
Well,
But yeah, maybe we wouldn't live in the
in the
desert.
long run, then. Like there's some places that are not that lack the capacity to support even moderately complex civilization. So if you were in the middle of the Sahara Desert right now with an aquaponic greenhouse, that's going to have a limited lifespan, and at some point you're going to move. But I mean, humans are animals. We have that ability to move, and we can take plants and other animals with us in a way that no other species has been able to do before. Like you see fungus cultivating beetles, for example, carry the yeasts that they use for breaking down cellulose on their body when they migrate. We can do that times 1,000. Like a little peasant with a backpack filled with seeds that they've accumulated over, however many generations, can just pick up sticks and move to another valley. Our only problem at the moment is we've kind of run out of valleys on this planet, so we're up against a wall.
Yeah,
but,
I think
our ability to adapt is unlike any other species that's come before us.
But I think that what you just said, our ability to adapt, is unlike any other species that has come before us, and yet we're out of empty valleys. Are two sides of this coin that are really difficult to work with, because you can't just pick up and leave. I mean, you can go to a different city and you can move, but for a lot of people, jobs hold them in place. I mean, I suppose that if you're talking about the collapse of industrial civilization, then the jobs won't be there and people will become nomadic again and freed from the constraints of location. But I just think that there's a tremendous number of people that want to hold on to the best parts of the system, which is that they look at the success of the internet and of TikTok and YouTube and all of these and Substack and all these places where people make money by putting out ideas. There's a huge ecosystem for that, and people want to participate in it as much as they want to support it. And if you changed it so that the people who were currently making that world were then focused instead on growing food, that would, I think, decimate the landscape, because you can't really maintain interest in political, philosophical, scientific questions if what you're doing is farming. Unless your questions are centered on farming, which that might be the case. But
yes, it does seem a bit anti-enlightenment in that sense.
There's a history of utopian communities that basically decide that they're going to move into the countryside, abandon industrial life, start to farm, and then have these places of great intellectual fervor. But they realize really, really quickly that, holy shit, farming is really hard and we're not very good at it. And it's all that we can do to farm. There's no intellectual development that's happening.
And Jebediah is sleeping with everybody's wives.
Yeah, that's true.
I definitely don't see us just going back to a pre-industrial model. I think there will be lingering impacts of the industrial era that transform fundamentally. A good analogy would be the series of events that seem to have pushed humans to create agriculture in the first place. So apart from the climate changing, one major factor was a relatively rapid period of sea level rise. So that would have caused people who were previously living on the coast to migrate inland and created a higher population density and a whole different series of demands and incentives and interactions that weren't happening before. That was probably critical in driving the first steps of agriculture. It's almost like a diesel engine, that if you take that vapor and you compress it and heat it up in the process, that creates a spark that causes a rebound that creates a system change, a catalysis. So I would like to envision on the far side of industrialization a human culture that values biological experimentation in a way that we only barely started to do in the agricultural revolution the first time around.
What are the specifics of that?
It's basically, it would probably have to be, see, here's the thing, you have to figure out culturally durable forms of practice, which, if you look at history, tends to be something like a religion. And you could argue that the way we view rationalism in the industrial age is its own kind of form of religion. It's a series of beliefs that, if you poke around it, like, their foundations aren't always like necessarily established by their own principles. So you just kind of you need a starting point, basically. So yeah, a system that understands the basic techniques you can use to play around with living organisms, that there's a possibility of creating something once in a blue moon that's extremely unlikely, that could lead to all sorts of new possibilities.
What would keep a religion from being corrupted by the same parasitism that has played out every single time in the past?
That's a good point. And yeah, I go back to the idea that it's about having spare resources, to have a culture that values maintenance of spare resources. And when you think about this, if you've got a hypothetical, like, completely even landscape, like all the resources are completely uniform, and you've got two villages side by side, and one of them reaches its limit of the carrying capacity and has 100 people, the other one has a culture which prevents that from happening and stays at 80 as its population. This is the dynamic that kind of created civilization. The side that has the more numbers has the potential to attack and overrun the one that was more responsible. And it's interesting, there are examples of cultures that have managed to get out of this trap. And I think I would point to the tribes of North America that had power distribution systems that seem to have been informed by a history of these centralized authoritarian states springing up and collapsing in their past. So like the mound cultures of Cahokia look like they were some kind of centralized authoritarian desperation-based mass agriculture. But yeah, other tribes, well, there's evidence of people taking up and putting down agriculture to going back to being hunter-gatherers because it was actually better for them. Ironically, going to a period of chaotic climate could make this the default setting for large swathes of the planet, that agriculture just simply isn't possible anymore because it's not reliable enough. I mean, I've found this in Australia. We've got a very unpredictable climate here. We always have. And what I was saying about pre-industrial civilizations having crop failure once every 5 years, like that seems to be about the limit of unreliability, that you can smooth that over and maintain complexity. In Australia, I think it's probably 1 in every 2 years you have a crop failure if you try and grow a staple grain. So yeah, maybe other forms of arranging civilization are going to emerge spontaneously in the absence of stable climate and industrial resources.
Something's going to change. I don't know what.
Well, I would point out as well too that new human cultures, new ethnicities, are often the result of hybridization events. So the Polynesians, for example, genetic analysis has shown that they were founded by a small group of men that left Taiwan, that traveled through Melanesia, picked up women along the way, and then traveled out into the Pacific. And that hybridization event created a whole new kind of people. The industrial age has involved moving people all over the planet in a way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise, and creating, what do they call them? Mestizo, mixed up populations. So most of South America, there's pockets in Africa where local populations have become mixed. The Philippines is a really good example of a very diverse founding population there. I suspect that those represent hybrid swarms, for want of a better descriptor, that have the potential to travel in a whole lot of different new directions when new selective pressures are put on them.
It seems like a more violent world, doesn't it?
Possibly. I mean, is it Graeber who's done no Pinker who's like the homicide rate through history
Hmm.
has been like steadily decreasing. So while we have a culture of like paying attention to like these big flashy wars, the number of people actually being killed through violence has been decreasing. Whether that reverses or not,
I would
who can
argue that
say?
the decreases in people dying from homicides must have to do with security and stability and
Mm,
the direction of those impulses into other things. Probably the prison industrial complex doesn't hurt either.
mm.
I don't know if it helps too much.
I mean, if you
It's
lock
interesting
people
though. It's
away.
there's a domestication syndrome in civilized humans. So they go through a process of eugenics where the most violent individuals are either picked out by the like the criminal legal system, and like if you look at early history in Europe, they were particularly good at finding young men before they had a chance to reproduce, like hanging anyone for like violent crimes at the first opportunity. And likewise, when you send people to war, the ones that are most likely to like charge into battle are the ones who have the least self-control and the most violent tendencies. They tend to not come home from war. Um, so, but when that process goes on for long enough, you end up with a society that is so lacking in the capacity for aggression that they tend to be conquered by nomadic people who have maintained a functional level of aggression. I mean, this happened in China. Like the Mongols came in and just said, okay, we're staying. We're your new rulers now. And I think there's a history of that happening repeatedly in various places where you have regions with high enough fertility to support intensive agriculture and like settled populations, and then you have hinterlands which can only support pastoralism. So you end up with a kind of repeated pattern of hybridization between those two groups.
We don't tend to think about humans as hybridizing, and I think that that maybe is a disservice to us when we're thinking about the arcs of modern human populations, because there's definitely characteristics that are associated with places on Earth. And you said, I think correctly, that the industrial civilization has led to the mixing of those populations to kind of create this even keel representation of person
Mm.
that is bought into the industrial system. And it seems
Human
like,
resources, like that industrial commodity sugar that you can pour from tanker to tanker. It's
yeah,
easy to manage because it's uniform.
exactly. And so everybody agrees on the rules, and the rules make it really easy to operate. And there's the people that are on the outside that are not with it, and gradually they get either conquered or
Assimilated.
assimilated cultural change over generations. But the minute that there stops being a uniculture, it's hard for me to believe that violence doesn't come immediately afterwards. Because these are the same way that you can breed violence out of a people over the course of a couple of generations. Surely you can breed violence back into them in the same number of generations.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, a current example would be Haiti, where the power structure basically evaporated and it's devolved into factions of warlords who have taken over chunks of what's left of society. Something very, very similar happened in Western Roman civilization as it disintegrated. It's reorganizing itself on a more localized scale with the resources that are left.
So, like, what prevents somebody after the decline of industrial civilization from just coming and taking everything that you've ever worked for?
Um, that's very much a possibility. There's a limit to how well it's an equilibrium, isn't it? Like if the marauders completely destroy the farmers, then there's going to be nothing left for them to take next time.
Well,
Most people aren't farmers, though.
they'll start
Yeah.
enslaving at some point. You maraud and take
Yes,
for a
yeah,
while,
yeah.
then you enslave.
Yeah, if you have enough surplus population to allow that to happen, then yes, that's an option as well too. Um,
Like that's
I,
the thing. That's the thing about this, where I'm like, look, industrial civilization might very well collapse. I am with you 100%. It seems very creaky right now. Lots of things are wrong, but there is this cultural acceptance of we're going to deal with things diplomatically. We're not going to just take things from each other without going through the proper channels. There's the rule of law. We agree on what the laws are. There's democratic systems. You can argue that they're not actually democratic systems and the corporations are robbing us blind. But at the very least, you can walk down the street and not be worried that somebody's going to break into your farm and take all your stuff while you're gone and burn it to the ground. But that's not a thing that was that you could have avoided before this centralized domain of violence was given over to the massive state. And if you take away the massive state, I feel like what you're doing is you're taking this weighted blanket off of people's nature, and the nature is not the prettiest thing that I've ever seen.
Yes, yeah. I would maybe point out, though, that human psychology tends to focus on violence because it's something we can potentially deal with as an individual. But if you actually look at the main drivers of demographics, particularly during population decline, for every one person that dies of violence, there's probably 100 that die of infectious disease. I mean,
which is also a problem.
It is. I think it's more of an issue, and it's something that I'm more interested in paying attention to. So yeah, particularly like look at the world wars, for example, like the biggest orgy of industrialized violence ever. With World War One, more people died in the year after the war ended from Spanish flu than during the 4 years of conflict. And our attention, it's kind of like
so hold on, I want to say something. I want to add something, which is that is largely attributed to being kind of a coincidence, right?
Yeah, it's interesting.
I want you to open the bag. I want you to open the bag of worms, so to speak, because I think that generally people are like, yeah, there was a flu that came out of the war, and the massive death toll. Sure, some populations were weakened, but it's not attributed entirely to that industrial orgy. And I wonder if you have insight on that.
Yeah. So again, it's funny, like with our most recent pandemic, the data is messy and disputed, and like in this day and age, we still can't agree on what the statistics and the data are and the causes and everything. So for something a century ago, it's obviously much more difficult. I would point out that, again, nutrition was probably an issue, that globally the economies were strained and people were probably cutting back on the quality of their food intake. So infectious disease was more likely to spread and more likely to cause serious illness. There were more populations moving, but probably not that dramatically different before and after. The other really interesting thing that doesn't get mentioned much with the Spanish flu epidemic is we now think, or at least some people are arguing, that some of the deaths were attributed to people overdosing on aspirin, which was the new wonder drug of the age. So there are recommendations for people to take 2, 3, 10 grams of aspirin a day to fight the symptoms of influenza. And that was probably at least one of the factors behind working age, otherwise healthy people dying in unprecedented numbers from this particular strain of influenza. It may have been a iatrogenic epidemic, if you want to put it that way. And there's been similar arguments put forward that at least some of the deaths from COVID were due to inappropriate or improperly metered treatments for that particular condition. But whether that's true or not, I don't know.
You brought this up as a function of the post-collapse rate of infectious disease. You started talking about World War One, and then I
so you're worried about disease, and for me, that's like worrying about being eaten by a shark when you go swimming, when you're 1,000 times more likely to just drown in a wave that was just a bit too big. And
you mean you're worried about violence?
Yeah, so humans in a collapse scenario are really focused on violence. American doomers and preppers love thinking about guns and all this kind of stuff. You're far more likely to get a scratch that becomes sepsis because you didn't eat enough protein. And nobody's going to write a epic poem about that event. It's just going to happen in the background and people are going to move on.
Yeah, one thing also occurs to me about the post-collapse violence too, which is that you would probably be really fast to organize with people around you to defend against marauders. And I feel like something approximating a local state with a local militia would appear very quickly. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think that a collapse means there's not going to be states. Plural is important there, because that seems to be the natural response to feeling defenseless, right? I mean, the first thing I'm going to do if the government falls apart is go talk to all my neighbors and figure out how we're going to make this work, right? And part of that is inevitably going to involve defense. And so I think that you're not talking about the end of the end of society or something. You're just talking about a phase transition, really, which is probably more geared towards local states.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a relocalization, and there's always a dynamic between producers and opportunists that eventually reaches an equilibrium. But yeah, in terms of your chances of being murdered by a highwayman or a raider, you're far more likely just to die of an infectious disease that is completely unremarkable.
That's not a consolation.
Well, look at it this way. Like, here's the thing. Like, everyone who is alive today is going to die. Like, that's an unremarkable statement that has been true for the last however many billions of years, millions of years you want to think about of life on Earth.
I don't think that people believe that.
But the really interesting question is, 100, 1,000 years from now, who are going to be the people that replace us? And it probably won't be 8 billion of us. It's probably going to be a smaller number in the way I look at the resources that are available. And that's been normal for most of history. And it probably won't be a completely uniform cross-section of the people who are alive now. There will be winners and losers, for want of a better way of putting it. But that process will change who we are as a species. And that's the whole point of history, to become something different. And this is how it happens, through bottlenecks. I did an article recently on my Substack, The Genie and the Bottleneck, and I actually looked back at the history of humanity. So Homo sapiens definitely came out of a major population bottleneck where there was all sorts of chaos and disaster and actually extra pressure. Homo erectus, there's arguments that there were things going on around at the time when they came out of the woodwork that caused that change. And the same with civilization itself. It emerged through a period of very unusual chaos. And maybe that's just the way it has to be. Maybe if we're perfectly comfortable sitting in our utopia, that's the end of history, as Fukuoka like to imagine. But it doesn't work like that. You can't stay in paradise for long, even if you manage to get there. And,
that's kind of why I feel like the escape from this is not a move backwards. The escape from this is the transhumanist, post-singularity, free from death, disease.
Yeah, I was going to say there's definitely a dream of some of these bigger authors and bigger platforms that humans are going to solve disease and cure aging, right? That's a professed goal.
I used to work in an aging laboratory.
That's and they believe it, right?
Oh yeah.
It's going to not be a problem in the future.
See, the problem is you can't productively solve those problems in isolation without also solving the cultural issues of overpopulation. So, yeah, it's
and that's what this neatly gets us to.
I think Bill Gates agrees with that.
Wait, say it again?
I would say Bill Gates agrees with him.
I'm sure he does, right? And that's the thing, is that, look, we know that we have a really strong, rich group of people who want to live forever. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, I would put them at that half-cooked level of spiritual enlightenment.
Right? I mean, okay, so there's a group of people who want to live, if not for forever, for a really, really long time. They're putting a ton of money into figuring out how to do it. Okay. That same group of people is also really concerned about population size. And that same group of people is also investing heavily into artificial intelligence, mechanization, Neuralink, and surveillance technologies. And there's and nuclear, right? Because there's a huge push for nuclear. There's a lot of people that are doing their best to make sure that our power system transitions to nuclear. So that to me seems like the speciation event is that those people are going to they're going to achieve their transhuman goals, and everybody else is just fucked.
again, I would point out that they still need us in ways that maybe even they don't fully appreciate. A good example of this would be like private jets. So if you want to fly a private jet, you have to be a certain level of wealth, and you buy the jet and you fly it around. You feel like you're in charge of the system, but the airports themselves are cross-subsidized by mass consumption. The whole fossil fuel system that makes that jet fuel turn up when you have your money to buy it depends on this huge pyramid that's beneath you. And like you said, like if there's only a few 100 million people left on the planet, certain forms of technology that rely on a foundation of a particular scale just might not be possible anymore.
I think that the arc would be that scenic areas would be developed into playgrounds for the uber wealthy, and the rest of the world would be left to go to seed. It would be basically a place that you would go to on safari. Rich people have this love of doing really difficult things for the sake of doing difficult things. Like, I know people that work in the tech industry, make really good salaries, and then will hire a drill sergeant to make them do push-ups in the ocean. Like, it's a phenotype. And so that same phenotype is the same one that's like, I'm going to live forever because I'm doing push-ups in the ocean, and I want to be able to go somewhere beautiful. Somewhere beautiful is somewhere that doesn't have a lot of people. And so the garden planet is perfect because you don't have an airplane. You have a drone that brings you, or a Zeppelin, or whatever the fuck else you have, that just drops you in some location that's not accessible by roads, where there's an underground greenhouse that grows all of the food. And so all of the resources of the civilization that are maintained at the level that they are right now are channeled into the wealth and well-being of a small number of people that have managed to achieve escape velocity.
I see the model that you're coming from, but yeah, I think the symbiosis between the masses and the elites cannot be decoupled by technology alone. Like, the technology itself still needs layers of, lesser status people to operate. And the idea that that technology is ever going to become completely independent of people, I think is unrealistic. Which means that eventually the whole pyramid is going to come down.
But why do you think that it's unrealistic? Like, that's the thing that I don't get, because they're putting a tremendous amount of effort into building machines that can replicate human functionality. And when you put a ton of... And these are the people that literally, like, I know...
Well, just because you work really hard at something doesn't mean you're going to pull it off, too.
It's the resources that make those machines possible depend on, like, peasant and slave human labor all the way down the economic pyramid. And those resources are limited. They're going to expire within probably a century at the most.
Okay, nuclear power, robots mining cobalt. Robotic mining is probably going to be the first thing that happens, because it's a huge PR disaster for every single one of these companies. Tesla just put out these like new Tesla bots.
Are they going to be able to fix your drain when it clogs up?
Yeah, of course. Like, I
would point out the weak link is the amount of energetically, economically recoverable cobalt in the whole system is eventually going to reach a point where
they'll
it's just
strip
not there.
mine the ocean floors. There's like
the
world's cobalt supplies are, there's like a valley in the ocean that has like doubles the world's cobalt supplies. They'll just strip mine that shit.
It's a concentration issue. I mean, look at it this way. So at the moment, we're mining lithium from like salt flats around the world, these salt deposits, turning it into lithium batteries. And we currently have no economically feasible way of recycling the lithium that we've already mined. So it just ends up in landfill. Or it ends up in such small pieces mixed through the landfill that the energy needed to pick all of that back out again is more than the raw resource. So eventually the resources become so diffuse that it's impossible to find the energy to extract them and purify them.
But you can have a thorium reactor in every robot.
I'll believe that when we actually have thorium reactors. And,
yeah, I think this all comes
even if they are theoretically possible, I think we might have left it too late with the rate at which chaos is unfolding because of systemic stress to roll them out at the scale and the speed that is necessary to stop us from hitting an energetic wall.
Yeah, it just seems like it's it's a race. It's like, can the techno-utopians pull off their immortality dream in time? And it seems like you're coming down hard on the side of absolutely not, which is reassuring to some extent.
Yeah, a really good analogy would be how you start a fire. So if you've got a little tiny spark coming off a flint or a quartz, you need just the right kind of special kindling to get that to form a little tiny flame. And then you use that little tiny flame to get some twigs to burn. And then you use that bigger flame to get some branches to burn. And then eventually, any size log you could add to your fuel source. If you tried to take that spark and apply it directly to the biggest log in the forest, nothing's going to happen. So there's a sequence of events of using one resource to leverage into another. But it isn't guaranteed that you're always going to succeed in those transitions. And this is where I feel like we are with renewable energy and fusion and nuclear power, that we've burnt through our convenient sized logs that were quite relatively easy to get burning after like a few thousands of years of pushing up against biological limits. We figured out how to start using coal and then oil. But that resource can be depleted before we are organized enough to use that larger fire to ignite the nuclear or the renewable resource pool. We could actually hit a wall and be forced to go back to getting by on twigs.
But isn't the reluctance to use nuclear or the lack of nuclear power have nothing to do with our technological ability to do it, but rather our social will towards it? Because people are really freaked by nuclear.
It's partly a complexity issue. So, and it's interesting, like this trend continues through the different fuel sources. So like in many ways, coal is a inferior fuel to oil, but you can use coal in much simpler engines. You've got external combustion engines, you've got steam engines, where the technology needed to make a functional steam engine is way simpler than you need for an internal combustion engine to use oil. And even those engines need refined oil, whereas you can put wood, you can put mummies from Egypt. They used to use mummies to like run the steam trains. There were so many of them. But you move to like more and more delicate machines functioning off more and more specialized fuels. And the next step isn't always guaranteed. And yeah, I suspect the next step to nuclear isn't working in a way that provides us a bridge into a technological future. And even just the logistics. So like if you had a functional, like working model of a fusion reactor or a thorium reactor, and you wanted to smoothly replace the existing fossil fuel infrastructure, the rate at which you would need to build those plants is completely off the charts. Like it's so infeasible. And it's partly a systematic issue as well. Like, is that electric energy that you're going to get out of those plants going to be able to couple to concrete production? Is it going to be able to couple to steel production directly? Particularly concrete is a major weak link because we're running out of quality sand necessary for producing structural concrete. And maybe there's some way for thorium reactors to make electricity to create the right kind of sand from scratch. But things get more and more complicated to keep all of the complexity together and integrated.
And coupled to the stagnation in the development, right? We haven't really made any progress on this fusion project since the whole thing came about. I mean, these headlines are completely misleading. And the way I'm looking at it, it comes down to some serious fundamental errors in the way that we understand how stars work. And that's a paradigm that you can't touch inside of the institutional structures as they stand right now. And I wonder how many other little pieces are just jammed up like that, where we actually could move into a brighter future with some of these things, but because of the incentive structures that are in place, that's not about to happen anytime soon.
It's kind of ironic because the only examples of that kind of pre-crisis scientific culture is incubated by extremely rich billionaires who decide to throw some money at like an institute or a funding structure that is completely separate to everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of the old patronage system where a lot, you'd have a butcher who showed some, proficiency with electricity in the days when nobody knew what was going on with electricity, and would provide them with just that little nest where they didn't have to worry about where their food was coming from or whether they'd be homeless if their experiments didn't work. So yeah, ironically, the evil ultra rich elites might be the only chance for sparking divergent, playful, serendipitous science again. But yeah, my general
I'm
feeling is
counting on
that it's too little, too late.
Well, yeah, we'll see. Like, again, it's a race, right? But I do think that the alternative funding structures could save science, whether it happens or not. I think it's possible.
Did you want to briefly talk about what some of my predictions are for unexpected things in the near future?
Yeah, let's close down with that.
Yeah, so I would harken back to the Belle Epoque. So this was a relatively long period of peace in Europe leading up to World War I and II. And during this period, all sorts of industrial innovations were happening, and military laboratories were like playing around with these new ideas behind closed doors. So when World War I broke out, people had this historic idea about what warfare looked like. It was like horses and bayonets, and they had an idea of what it should be. And then you end up with all of these new horrific technologies unleashed upon the world, and it was like utterly astonishing. And the reason why I bring that up is that we've recently gone through the Pax Americana, where the world has been relatively free from major conflicts for, what's it been now, nearly a century, 80 years? And in the meantime, all of this amazing technology has been developed, and military labs have been playing around with it behind closed doors. And if we ever have a proper conflict again, it has the potential of being wheeled out and surprising the world. So a really good example of this would be AI-targeted blinding lasers. So there are systems that have been developed that can identify human targets, I think even over the horizon, and fire a laser beam directly into someone's face and blind them, which would be more effective than kinetic weapons in actually crippling your enemy, because now they've got all of these people that they need to give them some kind of care. So yeah, that's an example of a weapon type which there are international conventions about limiting its development. Who knows who's actually following them to the letter of the law, because we live in a relatively opaque system. But that's a
Not the winners of World War III, certainly.
So usually a new technology is a combination of things that are more than the sum of the parts. So one of them that I see is the combination of rapid virus evolution with rapid vaccine production. So previously, if you wanted to do biological warfare with infectious agents, you were limited because of the chance of blowback. So you couldn't necessarily target your enemy in any specific way. Now that we have the tools to develop new viruses and rapidly develop matching vaccines, that dynamic is broken down. So one state actor, or maybe something even smaller than what we think of state actors, could develop these two in parallel, and you would have an opportunity for asymmetric impact from an infectious bioweapon. And if you look at the history of who actually dies, like for every one person that dies of actual conflict, the potential impact of epidemics is vastly beyond what we normally think of as weapons. So that's one combination.
We better get a lot better at making vaccines.
Anyway, I'll mention another thing with that in a minute. So another one is for non-infectious biological weapons like ricin, like toxins, or chemical weapons like VX. If you just look at the amount it takes to kill a person, it's like this tiny, like fraction of a milligram. It seems incredibly dangerous, but they have a delivery problem. If you actually want to get that toxin into the enemy, just releasing clouds of gas is like, it just doesn't work. Like they tried that in World War One. It was great for psychological horror because the few people that did die of it was a horrible way to go. But it didn't actually have that much of an impact. It was just an annoyance. The other thing we have is the emergence of drone technology, but they have limited battery capacity. So their ability to carry kinetic weapons like guns and bombs is a bit of a problem. Like the amount of impact they can have, it's still considerable. Like the way they're being used is really alarming. But if you combined those two together, a micro drone with a chemical or biological payload, it only needs to deliver a fraction of a milligram of the agent to the target, and it's done its job. And you can make this even more terrifying if those micro drones are using AI to operate semi-autonomously. So you could geofence a region, send in a swarm of these drones that are smart enough to independently identify anything that looks like a human and deliver, a milligram of VX to them. And one drone could probably kill 100, 1,000 people, provided it didn't get intercepted.
Horrifying.
So, yikes.
Horrifying, yes. But me being ever the optimist, if the alternative is nuclear weapons and missiles raining down, at least at the end of this process, the infrastructure is still intact. So
it's a nice empty room, at least.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, we don't have the spare resources to rebuild cities like we did after World War II. Like in some ways, that was, some people argue that it was like a huge economic stimulus and it allowed societies to like reform themselves. If we nuke a city today, it stays nuked. Like the resources for rebuilding it, just, it's not as easy to do that as it once was. The economy has changed.
So what's your timeline for the breakdown of the Pax Americana?
It's kind of already happening. If you look at major players kind of shifting away from the US dollar as the central instrument of trade. It's going to be interesting to see what happens afterwards, because so major conflicts normally happen when there's something worth fighting over. So like Rome and Carthage fought for dominance of trade in the Mediterranean. And after Britain lost its preeminence as like leader of the world empire, Germany and Russia wasn't as expansionist in a global sense, but it was dominating its region. And the US were kind of the contenders to take over from Britain as being the economic center of the next system. So what happens when there is no prize to fight over? And I think looking at what happened to Rome after it won the Punic Wars is probably the best example. It's fragmentation into different regions, which then kind of snipe at each other, but there's no resources or incentive for full-scale invasion anymore. It becomes a beggar thy neighbor kind of strategy. The best way of your particular group accessing resources is to cripple the ability of your competitors to access that resource. And we're moving into an era where we have the perfect tools for doing that. So with biowarfare, you have plausible deniability. If you release a biowarfare agent, it's like, it wasn't me. My troops aren't invading your country. It had nothing to do with me. Likewise, with cyber warfare, you can theoretically, covertly cripple your enemies' or competitors' systems to free up more resources for you to use. And it's not always like just sabotage. It is also informational warfare, which we see hints of in the current informational ecosystem. There's all sorts of information flying around with everyone pointing fingers.
I mean, I appreciate the lodging of predictions. I hope this does not come to pass. It would be worst case scenario if it did, but I also recognize that things do seem, more than anything, it seems like people want things to change. We talked earlier about the way that people play into these narratives and lean into things like this, and I feel like people are bored. Like, one thing we didn't talk about is, in addition to having resources, I think people really need to have something that they are struggling with and struggling to overcome, and war is that, if nothing else. And so yes. I get this feeling in people that they want open conflict. Everybody's just kind of giddy about the prospect, it's like, oh man, there might be terrible things that happen. Wouldn't that be terrible?
We can watch it on TV. I wish I could find, I've gone looking for this resource. So, in Brave New World, the core idea in it is that people are told the world is divided into these large factions that are constantly fighting each other, and that the common person has to sacrifice and support this war effort as part of their patriotic duty, and were encouraged to hate one enemy or another.
Is that Brave New World, or is that Orwell?
Yeah, sorry, no, that was 1984. That was 1984, yes. And it's funny because there was a journalist in the 70s who investigated the Vietnam War and presented it in pretty much that structure. It was a documentary around Gorky Park. So his argument was that the Soviet Union and the West weren't really enemies of each other. They were constructed as enemies as a means of controlling domestic populations in just the way that was outlined in 1984. So, for example, after World War II, Russia was basically flattened, and the Ford company came in and re-industrialized Russia. That's how they managed to come back so rapidly. And the reason why they did that is that they wanted a multipolar world, because human psychology needs external enemies in order to maintain internal cohesion. And in the 70s, he was investigating the Vietnam War, which was a proxy war between the Soviets and the West. And there were reports from the American soldiers that the northern Vietnamese, the communists, were driving around in trucks that looked pretty much identical to American trucks. And the reason why is that they came from this Soviet plant, Gorky Park, and they were originally built based on designs from the Ford company. So it's almost like a Punch and Judy show, that you've got these two characters that seem like they're in conflict, and it's entertaining, and it taps into ancestral human psychological needs. In order to maintain cohesion of one group, you need to perceive that there's an enemy. Again, going back to that cultural schismogenesis, that maybe humans as they are today are incapable of unity on a global scale. It's just not in our psychological nature, because we need enemies to define ourselves against. So yeah, that's an interesting idea to throw out there.
I mean, I agree with that.
Yeah,
maybe a listener knows this resource, because I've gone looking for it and I can't find it. Again, it's just either it's been memory hold, or I'm just looking at the wrong search terms, and I haven't had any luck. But it made an impression on me. For this documentary, this journalist in the 1970s, I'm pretty sure he was British, and he was investigating the Vietnam War, and it led him back to this idea that the Soviet Union was constructed as an enemy of the West. And this isn't completely irrelevant. I think similar parallels could be made with China today, which was very recently, very rapidly industrialized, partly for resource reasons. Gail Tverberg, the actuary that I recommended, who is studying the industrial system reaching its limits, she argued that the industrialization of China was mostly driven by China having the last high-quality coal reserves in the world that hadn't been tapped, that made all of that cheap industrialization possible.
Yeah, if you think of that documentary, let us know afterwards.
Yes,
I'd like to check that out.
I will keep searching for it, because it was fascinating, and it was very well put together. I don't think he was just a crackpot, but I mean, then again, who knows?
Yeah, there is definitely that need for the other. I worry about that too the most. But
I did want to finish up with one. I would call this a thought experiment, a purely speculative thought experiment of what you could potentially do with biotechnology in the future. So imagine you're an evil overlord and you realize that the human population needs to decrease in the future. So you could just allow it to happen at random and end up with, X% of the population left over in the process. But that would be a real missed opportunity to actually use that process to your ends. So this is the way you could potentially do it. So you could roll out a vaccine for disease A. So there'll be a disease B later. So disease A, you convince, you roll this out as a product to people, and you try and convince people that they should take this vaccine. But at the same time, you sow enough doubt in the population that people self-select, that the people who are most, psychologically, their constitution makes them obedient to authority. They're the people who say, yes, I will take vaccine A. And the people who are like, oh, but I keep seeing all of these other messages in this, mass controlled media that make me suspicious, I'm not going to take vaccine A. Then, after this has happened, you roll out disease B. Disease B is cross-reactive with disease A, but it's much more deadly. So that people who took vaccine A are protected, and people who did not take vaccine A suffer from disease B. They have an antigen in common. That's all it takes to get this kind of cross-protection. So from the evil overlord's perspective, you now have a smaller population, but you also have a more obedient population that is easier to manage in the future because, we're facing resource limits. It's going to be harder and harder to keep cohesion.
That's freaking terrifying, but it doesn't take into account natural immunity. So you would have some
yes.
pretty strong people that were dissidents remaining.
Well,
as
it's a numbers game. It's a numbers game. I mean, this is the thing. Even for HIV, approximately 5 to 10% of people have natural immunity to HIV, and you never find them because they get exposed and then they don't get it, and nobody really realizes. And we don't have many studies where you can try to infect people with HIV and see who actually gets it. That's just not possible in this day and age, for good reason. But yeah.
So I think that the plot of the dystopian sci-fi is that there's a group of people with natural immunity that have to band together in the aftermath and
that's it.
Take the evil overlord down.
That's it.
Well, there's always a residual. So yeah, that's where the fun, that's where the drama, that's where the serendipity and unexpected opportunities come from. Who knows, if they succeed, they could become the new elites and find themselves in exactly the same trap. It's I actually feel sympathy for the devil, for the elites in charge of the world today. It reminds me of astronauts kind of strapped to the top of thousands of tons of explosives. And history, even recent history, is full of examples of elites losing control of their populations. And I mean, Russian Revolution, French Revolution, that had a very chilling effect on the surviving elites of the world. They paid attention and came up with ways of making sure it didn't happen to them.
I always think about the picture that I saw of the activist setting up a guillotine outside of Jeff Bezos's house, where I'm like, that's ominous. I would have a hard time living with that afterwards. I think he got his new girlfriend right around that time. He tapped out.
Well, it's just interesting because so often in life you end up in situations where there is no perfect solution. So you're really choosing between, bad and worse. And yeah, I think people have to be mindful of that. And maybe something that seems dystopian isn't the worst of all possible worlds. And I would point out that our current industrial, consumerist utopia is an example of that. If you looked at it through the eyes of pre-industrial peasants who had independence and autonomy that we can't imagine, and connectiveness, the connectivity to the people around them, that, so many people are isolated and in despair in the current system. Yeah, I mean, what humans can get used to, what we can come to accept, even to change our minds within one lifetime, is amazing. It's the collective madness that kind of ties us together and allows us to change and change and change. I'm hopeful that what we become on the other side is beyond our current imagination. And our job is basically just to steward as many potentially useful resources into the future so that they have more options and possibilities to play with.
I like that.
I like that too. Yeah, I think that I would like to see humans become a globally cooperative, interplanetary, interstellar species at some point, but it seems like the road to that might not be the one that's publicized.
Oh, we're not ready. We're not ready to go into space. We're barely ready to manage continental scale economies. So,
I think the UFOs agree.
I mean, but again, what's the rush? We've got millions of years if we don't completely destroy ourselves in the short term. So let's just take a breath and enjoy being human and not feel this pressure and this desperation to conquer the galaxy tomorrow. Like, it's still going to be there, and we'll probably understand it a bit better if we take our time.
I like that.
Yeah. Well, let's catch up again down the road. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You spend so much time thinking about so many different things that I feel like you serve as the weaver of all of these different things together. And when Virus B comes around, you'll be top on our list to call.
We're going to be part of the nutrified resistance natural immunity crew. The heroes.
Hope. Indeed.
All right, man.
Well,
It's been really fun to catch up with you. Let's do it again.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I'll throw in a quick plug while I can too. My full sci-fi series is currently out. You can buy it in ebook form. Paperbacks are coming sometime in the future once I get that off the ground. But yeah, it's set in a distant future where human civilization is now built on purely biological technology. And it explores how individuals that don't quite fit into that utopia manage to navigate their way through and find meaning.
Fantastic. We'll drop links in the description.
Brilliant.
All right. Thanks, Shane.
Thanks, Shane.